The expulsion of the Hyksos rulers around 1550 BC marked the beginning of Egypt's most militarily aggressive and territorially expansive period. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty emerged from their victory not merely as restored rulers of a unified Egypt, but as conquerors determined to prevent foreign domination through overwhelming military superiority. This transformation from a defensive kingdom to an imperial superpower would define the next 5 centuries of Egyptian civilization. Thutmose III, who ruled from approximately 1479 to 1425 BC, embodied this new imperial ambition with unprecedented military campaigns that stretched Egyptian influence from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile deep into Nubia to the banks of the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. His 17 recorded military campaigns represent the most systematic conquest program in ancient Near Eastern history. The pharaoh's forces moved with calculated precision, utilizing bronze weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and composite bows that gave Egyptian armies technological advantages over their opponents. The Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC demonstrated Thutmose III's tactical brilliance and the effectiveness of Egyptian military organisation. Leading a coalition of Canaanite city-states, the ruler of Kadesh had positioned his forces in the strategically vital Jezreel Valley, controlling the main trade route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Rather than taking the safer, longer routes his generals recommended, Thutmose III chose the narrow Aruna Pass, emerging unexpectedly on the plain before Megiddo with his entire army intact. The Egyptian pharaoh personally led the charge in his golden chariot, his blue war crown gleaming as his forces scattered the enemy coalition. The siege of Megiddo lasted 7 months, during which Egyptian engineers constructed a massive wooden palisade around the city, starving the defenders into submission. Egyptian military success stemmed from superior organisation and logistics as much as battlefield tactics. The pharaoh's armies operated with supply trains that could sustain campaigns lasting months, while Egyptian naval vessels controlled the eastern Mediterranean coastline, preventing enemy reinforcement and ensuring reliable communication with the homeland. Thutmose III's forces captured 924 chariots, 2,041 horses, and countless weapons at Megiddo alone, demonstrating the scale of Egyptian military operations. The conquest of Nubia proceeded simultaneously with these northern campaigns, driven by Egypt's insatiable demand for gold and exotic materials. Egyptian forces pushed beyond the traditional border at the First Cataract, establishing fortified settlements at Buhen, Semna, and eventually reaching Kirgis near the Fifth Cataract. These weren't mere trading posts, but heavily fortified administrative centres, with massive mud brick walls, watchtowers, and permanent garrisons. The fortress at Buhen covered over 13,000 square metres, its walls rising 11 metres high and 5 metres thick, with elaborate gate systems and defensive towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Ramesses II, ruling from 1279 to 1213 BC, inherited this imperial system and expanded it further through both military conquest and diplomatic manoeuvring. His reign of 66 years allowed for sustained imperial policies that consolidated Egyptian control over territories from Nubia to the Levant. The pharaoh's military campaigns against the Hittite Empire culminated in the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, where an estimated 5,000 Egyptian chariots and 20,000 infantry faced a comparable Hittite force in the largest chariot battle of the ancient world. The battle itself revealed both Egyptian military capabilities and the challenges of maintaining imperial control at such distances from the homeland. Ramesses II had divided his army into 4 divisions named after major Egyptian deities: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. The pharaoh personally commanded the Amun division, advancing ahead of his main force when Hittite intelligence deceived him about enemy positions. Muwatalli II, the Hittite king, had concealed his main army behind the city of Kadesh, launching a devastating chariot attack that scattered the Ra division and threatened to destroy the Egyptian expedition entirely. Only the timely arrival of Egyptian reinforcements and Ramesses II's personal leadership prevented complete disaster. Contemporary reliefs showed the pharaoh standing alone in his chariot, his powerful bow drawn as enemy chariots swirl around him, his horses rearing as arrows fill the air. While Egyptian propaganda claimed total victory, the strategic situation remained unchanged, with neither empire able to decisively defeat the other at such distances from their respective heartlands. This military stalemate led to the world's first recorded peace treaty between major powers around 1259 BC. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty, preserved in both hieroglyphic and cuneiform versions, established precise territorial boundaries and mutual defence agreements. The treaty recognised Egyptian control over southern Syria and Palestine while acknowledging Hittite dominance in northern Syria and Anatolia. Both empires agreed to extradite political refugees and provide military assistance against common enemies, creating a stable international system that endured for generations. The administrative machinery that governed this vast empire represented one of history's most sophisticated bureaucratic systems. The vizier, typically holding the title Mayor of the City and Vizier of the South, or Vizier of the North, served as the pharaoh's chief administrator responsible for tax collection, judicial proceedings and provincial governance. The vizier's daily routine, recorded in tomb inscriptions, began before dawn with reports from district governors, continued through court sessions judging legal disputes, and concluded with detailed briefings on military supplies, granary levels, and public works projects. Provincial administration operated through a hierarchy of appointed officials answerable directly to the central government. The king's son of Kush governed Nubia with vice-regal authority, commanding both military forces and civilian administrators. This official resided in a palace at Aniba that rivaled royal residences in Egypt proper, complete with throne rooms, administrative offices, and private apartments, decorated with scenes of the pharaoh receiving tribute from Nubian chiefs. Similar administrative centres at Memphis controlled the Delta region, while Thebes remained the religious and ceremonial capital. Tax collection operated through a complex system that assessed agricultural production, craft output and trade revenues. Royal scribes conducted annual censuses, counting livestock, measuring field boundaries, and recording population figures with mathematical precision. The famous Wilbur Papyrus from the reign of Ramesses V provides detailed records of landholdings in Middle Egypt, listing individual farmers, their plot sizes and tax obligations calculated to the fraction of a grain measure. This bureaucratic thoroughness enabled the central government to extract resources efficiently while maintaining detailed records of imperial finances. The economic foundation of New Kingdom prosperity rested on three primary sources: Nubian gold production, Near Eastern trade networks, and tributary payments from vassal states. The gold mines of the Eastern Desert and Nubia operated on an industrial scale, with thousands of workers extracting ore under military guard. The Turin Papyrus map, dating to Ramesses IV's reign, shows detailed geological surveys of mining regions, complete with topographical features, well locations, and processing facilities. These mines produced an estimated 1,000 kilograms of gold annually during peak periods, providing the pharaoh with unprecedented wealth for military campaigns and monumental construction. Trade networks extended Egyptian commercial influence throughout the known world. Egyptian merchants operated permanent establishments in Ugarit, Byblos, and other Levantine ports, exchanging manufactured goods, papyrus and linen for cedarwood, silver and exotic materials. The Amarna letters reveal the complexity of these commercial relationships, with vassal rulers requesting specific Egyptian products while offering local specialties in return. The ruler of Al-Ashir regularly shipped copper ingots to Egypt, while Assyrian kings sought Egyptian gold and ivory for their palace decorations. The Amarna letters, discovered in the ruins of Akhetaten, provide unprecedented insight into New Kingdom diplomacy and international relations. These cuneiform tablets, written in Akkadian as the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, document correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and rulers throughout the region. The letters reveal a sophisticated system of international relations based on mutual recognition, gift exchange, and carefully negotiated agreements. Diplomatic correspondence followed established protocols that reflected relative power relationships. Great kings of Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire addressed each other as brother, exchanging elaborate gifts and arranging royal marriages to cement political alliances. Lesser rulers addressed the pharaoh as father or lord, acknowledging Egyptian suzerainty while maintaining local autonomy. The Mitannian king Tushratta's letters to Amenhotep III demonstrate this hierarchical system, combining expressions of friendship with requests for Egyptian gold and military support against Assyrian expansion. Marriage diplomacy played a crucial role in maintaining international stability. Egyptian pharaohs married daughters of foreign rulers, housing them in specially constructed palace complexes with retinues of servants and advisors from their homelands. These marriages weren't merely ceremonial but created lasting political bonds between royal families. When the Babylonian king Burnaburiash II complained that his daughter hadn't written to him from the Egyptian court, Amenhotep III assured him of her welfare and elevated status, demonstrating the ongoing importance of these diplomatic marriages. The wealth generated by imperial expansion funded the most ambitious construction projects in Egyptian history. The temple complex at Karnak grew continuously throughout the New Kingdom, with successive pharaohs adding pylons, courtyards, and sanctuaries that covered over 100 hectares. The Great Hypostyle Hall, completed under Ramesses II, contained 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows, their capitals carved to represent papyrus flowers and lotus buds. The central columns rose 23 metres high, their tops capable of supporting a platform large enough for 50 people to stand upon. Abu Simbel represented the pinnacle of New Kingdom architectural achievement and imperial propaganda. Ramesses II ordered the temple carved directly from living rock on the west bank of the Nile, positioning it to be visible to all river traffic entering Egypt from Nubia. The 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh, each standing 20 metres tall, dominated the landscape for kilometres in every direction. The temple's interior chambers extended 65 metres into the cliff face, their walls covered with detailed reliefs depicting Egyptian military victories and religious ceremonies. The economic infrastructure supporting these projects required careful coordination between multiple government departments. Stone quarries in the eastern desert operated year-round, with teams of workers extracting granite, sandstone, and other building materials under military supervision. Transport ships specially designed for heavy cargo carried massive obelisks and architectural elements down the Nile, their movements coordinated with flood seasons to ensure adequate water levels. The logistics of moving a single obelisk from Aswan to Thebes involved hundreds of workers, specialised equipment, and months of careful planning. Tribute payments from vassal states provided additional resources for imperial projects and military campaigns. The tomb of Rekhmir, vizier under Thutmose III, depicts foreign delegations presenting tribute to the pharaoh, their offerings including gold rings, ivory tusks, exotic animals, and manufactured goods. Nubian tribute consisted primarily of gold dust, ebony, ivory, and leopard skins, while Levantine vassals provided cedarwood, silver, horses, and crafted objects. These tributary relationships weren't simply exploitative, but created economic networks that benefited all participants through increased trade and cultural exchange. The military infrastructure necessary to maintain imperial control required constant investment and innovation. Fortified bases along major trade routes housed permanent garrisons equipped with the latest weapons and communication systems. Signal fires and messenger networks enabled rapid communication across the empire, allowing central authorities to respond quickly to local disturbances or external threats. The fortress at Zawiyet el Rakam on the Mediterranean coast included workshops for weapon production, stables for cavalry units, and administrative offices for coordinating military operations throughout the Western Delta. The sophisticated administrative machinery and military infrastructure that had sustained Egyptian imperial dominance for nearly 2 centuries faced its most severe internal challenge during the reign of Amenhotep IV, who would later rename himself Akhenaten. The pharaoh's radical departure from traditional Egyptian religious practices and governance structures created unprecedented disruption throughout the empire, undermining the very foundations upon which New Kingdom prosperity had been built. Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne around 1353 BC, inheriting an empire at its territorial and economic zenith. His father, Amenhotep III, had ruled for 38 years of unprecedented peace and prosperity, maintaining Egyptian dominance through diplomatic marriages, tribute collection, and the accumulated military reputation of his predecessors. The new pharaoh initially followed conventional patterns, appearing in traditional regalia and participating in established religious ceremonies at Thebes. However, within 5 years of his accession, he had initiated the most radical religious transformation in Egyptian history. The traditional Egyptian religious system centered on the worship of Amun-Ra as the supreme deity, supported by an extensive pantheon including Ptah, Thoth, Hathor, and hundreds of lesser gods and goddesses. This polytheistic framework had evolved over millennia, incorporating local deities from throughout Egypt and creating a complex theological system that justified pharaonic authority through divine kingship. The priests of Amun at Karnak had accumulated enormous wealth and political influence, controlling vast temple estates, managing international trade relationships, and serving as key advisors to the pharaoh on matters of state policy. Akhenaten's religious revolution began with the elevation of the Aten, represented as a solar disk with rays ending in human hands, to supreme status above all other deities. Initially, this appeared to be merely another example of pharaonic preference for a particular god, similar to earlier rulers who had promoted their favoured deities while maintaining the traditional pantheon. However, by his 6th regnal year, Akhenaten had declared the Aten to be the sole legitimate deity, ordering the closure of traditional temples and the cessation of worship for all other gods. The theological implications of this transformation extended far beyond religious practice into the fundamental structure of Egyptian society and governance. Traditional Egyptian religion provided the ideological framework that justified pharaonic authority, with the king serving as the earthly representative of the gods and the intermediary between divine and human realms. The complex mythology surrounding Osiris, Isis, and Horus established the pharaoh's divine nature through his identification with Horus, while the elaborate funerary practices centered on Osiris worship guaranteed eternal life for both rulers and subjects. Atenism rejected these fundamental concepts, presenting the Aten as a universal deity accessible only through Akhenaten himself. The pharaoh claimed exclusive communication with the Aten, positioning himself as the sole intermediary between the god and humanity. This theological innovation eliminated the traditional priestly hierarchy that had mediated between gods and worshippers for thousands of years, concentrating all religious authority in the person of the pharaoh, while simultaneously undermining the mythological foundations of divine kingship. The economic consequences of this religious transformation proved immediately devastating to established institutions throughout Egypt. The temples of traditional deities controlled approximately 1/3 of Egypt's agricultural land, employed thousands of priests, scribes, and craftsmen, and managed extensive trading networks that connected Egypt with foreign markets. Akhenaten's closure of these temples eliminated their economic activity overnight, creating unemployment for skilled workers and disrupting commercial relationships that had operated for generations. The Karnak temple complex alone employed over 80,000 people in various capacities, from high priests and temple scribes to agricultural workers and craft specialists. These individuals possessed specialized knowledge and skills that had been passed down through family lines for centuries, creating a professional class whose expertise became suddenly obsolete under the new religious system. The pharaoh's agents systematically defaced traditional religious inscriptions, throughout Egypt, chiselling out the names of Amun and other deities from temple walls, royal monuments and private tombs. Akhenaten's decision to abandon Thebes and construct a new capital at Akhetaten represented the physical manifestation of his religious revolution. The site, located on the east bank of the Nile approximately 300 kilometers north of Thebes, had no previous religious or political significance, allowing the pharaoh to create an entirely new urban centre dedicated exclusively to Aten worship. The city's construction began around his 5th regnal year and proceeded with remarkable speed, utilising corvée labour from throughout Egypt to build palaces, temples, administrative buildings and residential districts. The Great Temple of the Aten at Akhetaten differed fundamentally from traditional Egyptian temple architecture. Instead of the enclosed, darkened sanctuaries that characterised temples to Amun and other deities, the Aten temple consisted of open courtyards exposed to sunlight, reflecting the solar nature of the deity. The temple complex extended over 800 metres in length, containing multiple offering tables where priests presented food offerings directly under the sun's rays. This architectural innovation eliminated the mysterious, hidden aspects of traditional Egyptian worship, creating a more direct relationship between deity and worshipper. The royal palace at Akhetaten covered approximately 15 hectares, its walls decorated with scenes depicting Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters worshipping the Aten in informal family settings. These artistic representations marked a dramatic departure from traditional pharaonic iconography, showing the royal family in relaxed poses, embracing their children and participating in daily activities. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, exemplifies the artistic revolution that accompanied Atenism, with its realistic portrayal of individual features rather than the idealized representations typical of earlier Egyptian art. The administrative challenges of governing from Akhetaten while maintaining control over a vast empire proved insurmountable for Akhenaten's government. The pharaoh's obsession with religious transformation led to the neglect of foreign policy and military affairs, creating opportunities for Egypt's enemies to challenge established territorial arrangements. The Amarna letters document the deteriorating situation in the Levant, where local rulers repeatedly requested Egyptian military assistance against expanding Hittite influence and internal rebellions. Ribadi, ruler of Byblos and a loyal Egyptian vassal, sent over 50 letters to Akhetaten, describing Hittite-supported attacks on Egyptian territories in Syria and Palestine. His correspondence reveals growing desperation as Egyptian garrisons were withdrawn from frontier posts and redeployed to construction projects at the new capital. Ribadi's letters describe enemy forces capturing Egyptian strongholds, intercepting tribute caravans, and encouraging other vassal states to abandon their allegiance to Egypt. The pharaoh's responses, when they came at all, consisted of vague promises and minimal military support. The collapse of Egyptian authority in the Levant had immediate economic consequences for the empire. Tribute payments from Syrian and Palestinian vassals ceased as local rulers either joined anti-Egyptian coalitions or were conquered by Hittite-supported forces. Trade routes that had generated substantial revenues for the Egyptian treasury came under enemy control, disrupting commercial networks that connected Egypt with Mesopotamian and Anatolian markets. The loss of these revenues occurred precisely when the pharaoh's construction projects at Akhetaten demanded enormous financial resources. Akhenaten's religious policies also created internal resistance from traditional Egyptian elites who had built their careers and fortunes within the established religious system. The powerful priesthood of Amun at Thebes possessed extensive political connections throughout the government bureaucracy, the military officer corps, and provincial administration. These individuals viewed Atenism not merely as theological innovation, but as a direct threat to their economic interests and social status. The pharaoh's response to this opposition involved systematic purges of government officials suspected of maintaining loyalty to traditional religious practices. Archaeological evidence from Akhetaten suggests that many high-ranking officials relocated to the new capital under compulsion rather than choice, abandoning established estates and social networks in Thebes and Memphis. The disruption of these administrative relationships weakened the government's ability to collect taxes, maintain public order, and coordinate military operations. Military commanders faced particular difficulties under the new system, as traditional Egyptian military ideology incorporated religious elements that Atenism rejected. Egyptian soldiers had traditionally fought under the protection of specific deities, carrying standards depicting gods associated with their units and participating in religious ceremonies before major campaigns. The elimination of these practices undermined military morale and unit cohesion, contributing to the empire's military difficulties in foreign territories. The succession crisis that began during Akhenaten's final years reflected the broader institutional breakdown caused by his religious revolution. The pharaoh's heir apparent, a shadowy figure known as Smenkhkare, appears to have ruled briefly as co-regent before disappearing from historical records around 1336 BC. The circumstances surrounding Smenkkare's reign remain unclear, with some evidence suggesting he attempted to restore traditional religious practices while maintaining Akhenaten's theological innovations. Tutankhamun, who ascended to the throne as a child of approximately 9 years, inherited an empire in crisis. The young pharaoh's reign began at Akhetaten under the guidance of powerful advisors, including Ai, who'd served in Akhenaten's administration, and Horemheb, a military commander who had maintained Egyptian positions in the Levant during the worst period of imperial decline. These regents faced the enormous challenge of restoring governmental functionality, while managing the religious and political consequences of Akhenaten's revolution. The restoration process began with Tutankhamun's return to Thebes and the systematic reopening of traditional temples throughout Egypt. The young pharaoh's restoration stela, discovered at Karnak, describes the deplorable condition of Egypt's religious institutions, temples abandoned, their roofs collapsed, their courtyards overgrown with weeds, and their priestly personnel scattered. The document presents the restoration as a divine mandate to repair the damage caused by the preceding reign's religious policies. The economic aspects of restoration required careful negotiation between competing interests. The traditional priesthoods demanded full restoration of their temple estates and economic privileges, while the royal treasury lacked sufficient resources to fund both restoration projects and ongoing governmental operations. Tutankhamun's administration developed a compromise solution that restored temple operations while maintaining royal control over their most valuable assets, particularly gold mines and international trading relationships. The systematic destruction of Amarna period records began during Tutankhamun's reign and intensified under his successors. Royal agents removed Akhenaten's name from king lists, defaced his monuments, and dismantled buildings at Akhetaten for use in construction projects elsewhere. This damnatio memoriae extended to other members of Akhenaten's family, with Nefertiti and Smenkhkare disappearing from official records as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Ai's brief reign of 4 years continued the restoration process, while consolidating the political changes initiated under Tutankhamun. As an elderly courtier who had served both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, Ai possessed detailed knowledge of pre-revolution administrative procedures and international relationships. His correspondence with foreign rulers, preserved in fragmentary form, demonstrates efforts to restore Egypt's diplomatic credibility and rebuild the tributary relationships that had sustained imperial prosperity. The military situation required immediate attention as Hittite forces continued expanding into territories that Egypt had controlled for over a century. Ai's generals conducted limited campaigns in southern Palestine and Nubia, achieving sufficient success to discourage further enemy advances while avoiding the massive military commitments that the weakened Egyptian state could not sustain. These defensive operations marked a fundamental shift in Egyptian strategic thinking from imperial expansion to territorial preservation. Horemheb's accession to the throne around 1323 BC brought military expertise and administrative experience to the restoration effort. As a career military officer who had witnessed the empire's decline firsthand, Horemheb understood both the external threats facing Egypt and the internal reforms necessary to address them. His Edict of Horemheb, inscribed on a stela at Karnak, outlines comprehensive administrative reforms designed to eliminate the corruption and inefficiency that had developed during the Amarna period. The edict addresses specific problems that had emerged during the preceding decades: military officers extorting supplies from civilian populations, tax collectors embezzling revenues, and court officials accepting bribes for favourable legal decisions. Horemheb's solutions involved the establishment of new oversight mechanisms, the creation of appellate courts to review local judicial decisions, and the implementation of standardised procedures for tax collection and military supply procurement. The cultural impact of the Amarna period extended beyond immediate political and economic consequences to influence Egyptian artistic expression, architectural design, and literary production for generations. The realistic artistic style developed under Akhenaten continued to influence royal portraiture, while the open temple architecture pioneered at Akhetaten appeared in later construction projects. However, the theological innovations of Atenism disappeared completely, leaving no trace in subsequent Egyptian religious development. The international consequences of Egypt's internal crisis permanently altered the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Hittite Empire expanded its influence throughout Syria and northern Palestine, establishing client kingdoms that blocked Egyptian access to Mesopotamian trade routes. Assyria exploited Egyptian weakness to extend its control over territories in the upper Euphrates region, while Nubian vassals began asserting greater independence from central authority. These territorial losses reduced Egypt's tribute income and eliminated strategic positions that had been essential for maintaining imperial dominance. The restoration efforts of Horemheb and his successors had stabilised Egypt's internal administration and restored some measure of imperial prestige, but by 1200 BC, a far more devastating threat emerged from the northern waters of the eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples, as Egyptian scribes would later identify them, represented not a single unified force, but a confederation of maritime raiders whose coordinated attacks would shatter the established order throughout the ancient world. Their invasions coincided with the broader phenomenon historians term the Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic period that witnessed the destruction of major civilizations from Greece to Mesopotamia. The first Egyptian encounters with these seaborne invaders occurred during the reign of Meneptah, son and successor of Ramesses II. Around 1208 BC, Egyptian frontier posts in the western delta reported massive population movements along the Mediterranean coast, with displaced peoples moving eastward in unprecedented numbers. These weren't typical nomadic migrations, but organised movements involving entire populations travelling with their families, livestock, and portable possessions in ox-drawn carts, accompanied by fleets of ships carrying armed warriors. Meneptah's scribes recorded the names of these foreign groups with careful attention to their distinctive characteristics and origins. The Shurden, recognisable by their distinctive horned helmets and round shields, had previously served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies but now appeared as hostile invaders. The Luca, originating from the Anatolian coast, brought expertise in naval warfare and siege techniques that posed unprecedented challenges to Egyptian defensive preparations. The Tertia, possibly related to later Etruscan populations, demonstrated sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and advanced weapon-making capabilities. The Libyan Confederation that threatened Egypt's western borders had incorporated substantial numbers of these sea peoples, creating a formidable alliance that combined traditional desert warfare tactics with advanced maritime technology. The Libyan king Merera assembled a force estimated at over 20,000 warriors, including 2,600 Shurden, 2,200 Shekelesh, and smaller contingents of other Sea Peoples groups. this coalition possessed bronze weapons superior to many Egyptian armaments, composite bows with greater range and accuracy than standard Egyptian models, and tactical knowledge gained from campaigns throughout the Mediterranean. The decisive confrontation occurred near Pilla in the western delta, where Merneptah's forces engaged the invading coalition in a battle that lasted 6 hours and resulted in over 6,000 enemy casualties. Egyptian records describe the pharaoh personally leading his chariot forces in repeated charges against enemy formations, his golden armour gleaming as arrows darkened the sky above the battlefield. The Egyptian victory proved decisive but costly, with substantial losses among elite chariot units and evidence that only superior numbers and defensive positions had prevented Egyptian defeat. The captured enemy equipment revealed technological innovations that concerned Egyptian military commanders. Sea People's warriors carried iron weapons alongside traditional bronze armaments, demonstrating knowledge of metallurgical techniques that Egyptian smiths had not yet mastered. Their ships, constructed with advanced joinery methods and equipped with bronze-reinforced rams for naval combat, represented maritime technology superior to Egyptian river vessels. Most disturbing, interrogated prisoners described the complete destruction of major cities throughout the Aegean and Anatolian regions, suggesting that these invasions were symptoms of a broader civilizational collapse. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean confirms the catastrophic nature of these population movements. The great palace centres of Mycenaean Greece, including Pylos, Tiryns and Mycenae itself, show clear signs of violent destruction around 1200 BC. These weren't isolated raids, but systematic attacks that eliminated entire administrative systems, destroyed written records, and scattered populations across vast distances. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record desperate preparations for siege, including orders to coastal watchers and the mobilization of bronze smiths to produce weapons before the site's final destruction. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's primary rival for control of Syrian territories, faced even more devastating attacks from multiple directions. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, suffered complete destruction around 1180 BC, its massive fortifications breached, and its palace complex burned so thoroughly that the conflagration melted bronze artifacts and cracked stone foundations. Hittite records from the empire's final years describe coordinated attacks by land and sea, with enemy forces appearing simultaneously along the Anatolian coast and advancing overland through the Caucasus Mountains. The collapse of Hittite power created a power vacuum in Syria and northern Palestine that various groups rushed to fill. The Arameans, Semitic-speaking peoples from the Syrian desert, established kingdoms in Damascus, Hamath, and other strategic locations, while Assyrian forces expanded westward to claim former Hittite territories in the upper Euphrates region. These developments eliminated the buffer states that had protected Egyptian interests in the Levant, forcing Egypt to defend extended frontiers with reduced military resources. Ramesses III, who ascended to the Egyptian throne around 1186 BC, inherited this deteriorating strategic situation and proved himself the last great warrior pharaoh of the new kingdom. His reign would witness the most intensive period of Sea People's attacks on Egypt itself, requiring unprecedented military mobilization and innovative defensive strategies. The pharaoh's scribes recorded his preparations with characteristic Egyptian attention to detail, describing the construction of new fortifications along the Delta coast and the establishment of naval bases equipped with purpose-built warships. The great invasion of Ramesses III's 8th regnal year represented the climax of Sea People's pressure on Egypt. Contemporary records describe a coordinated assault involving both land and naval forces, with the enemy coalition advancing simultaneously along the Palestinian coast and through the Mediterranean Sea. The land component included the Peleset, who would later establish themselves as the biblical Philistines, along with contingents of Tieka, Danaan and Vashesh warriors. Their families travelled in massive ox-drawn carts, indicating their intention to establish permanent settlements rather than conduct temporary raids. The naval battle, depicted in extraordinary detail on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, showcases Egyptian defensive innovations and tactical adaptations. Egyptian ships, modified with elevated fighting platforms and reinforced prows, engaged Sea People's vessels in close combat, while archers on shore provided supporting fire. The reliefs show Egyptian marines boarding enemy ships with bronze axes and short swords, while enemy warriors, identifiable by their distinctive feathered headdresses and geometric shield patterns, fight desperately to maintain their vessel formations. The artistic representations at Medinet Habu provide unprecedented detail about Sea People's appearance and equipment. Peliset warriors wore distinctive feathered headdresses with geometric patterns, carried small round shields, and fought with straight swords and javelins. Their ships featured high prows decorated with bird heads, square sails for long-distance travel, and rowing positions for up to 30 oarsmen. The reliefs also show enemy families in their ox carts, women and children travelling with household possessions, pottery and livestock, emphasising the migration nature of these movements. The land battle occurred near the Egyptian fortress of Jahi in southern Palestine, where Ramesses III had concentrated his available forces to intercept the enemy advance. Egyptian records claim total victory, with over 12,500 enemy casualties, and the capture of numerous prisoners who were subsequently settled in Egyptian territory as agricultural workers and military colonists. However, the strategic situation remained precarious, as Egyptian forces lacked sufficient strength to pursue retreating enemies or re-establish control over lost territories. The aftermath of these campaigns revealed the fundamental changes that Sea People's invasions had wrought throughout the region. The Peliset established themselves along the southern Palestinian coast, founding the cities that would become Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. These settlements featured distinctive pottery styles, architectural techniques, and burial practices that reflected Aegean origins while adapting to local conditions. The Peliset military organisation, based on professional warrior bands rather than territorial militias, proved highly effective in subsequent conflicts with neighbouring peoples. Egyptian territorial losses accelerated following Ramesses III's campaigns, as the pharaoh's forces proved incapable of maintaining garrisons throughout the traditional imperial territories. The great fortress of Megiddo, which had controlled the vital Jezreel Valley since Thutmose III's conquest, was abandoned around 1150 BC as Egyptian administrators withdrew to more defensible positions closer to the homeland. Similar evacuations occurred throughout Syria and Palestine, with Egyptian forces retreating to a handful of coastal strongholds that could be supplied by sea. The economic consequences of these territorial losses compounded Egypt's military difficulties. Tribute payments from Syrian and Palestinian vassals had provided substantial revenues for the royal treasury, while the loss of trade routes eliminated commercial taxes and customs duties that had sustained imperial administration. The disruption of tin supplies from Anatolia and Cyprus created particular problems for Egyptian bronze production, forcing military commanders to implement strict rationing of metal weapons and tools. The broader Bronze Age collapse phenomenon extended far beyond the eastern Mediterranean to affect civilizations throughout the ancient world. The Indus Valley civilization experienced similar disruptions around this period, with major urban centres abandoned and trade networks collapsed. In Europe, the Urnfield culture emerged from the chaos of Bronze Age destruction, introducing new burial practices and settlement patterns that reflected fundamental social changes. Even distant China experienced political upheaval during this period, with the Western Zhou dynasty replacing the Shang rulers amid evidence of widespread warfare and population displacement. The causes of this civilizational collapse remained subjects of scholarly debate, with proposed explanations ranging from climate change and natural disasters to technological innovations and social revolutions. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought conditions around 1200 BC, potentially disrupting agricultural production and forcing population movements. The introduction of iron technology may have destabilized existing military balances, while social tensions within Bronze Age palace societies might have contributed to internal collapse. Egyptian records from this period describe unusual weather patterns, including failed Nile floods and extended periods of low rainfall in normally fertile regions. The Cannibal Hymn texts from this era reference widespread famine and social disorder, while administrative documents record emergency grain distributions and the suspension of normal tax collection procedures. These internal difficulties coincided with external military pressures, creating a crisis that stretched Egyptian administrative capabilities beyond their limits. The religious and cultural impact of the Sea People's invasions extended beyond immediate military consequences to influence Egyptian worldview and artistic expression. Traditional Egyptian concepts of cosmic order, which portrayed Egypt as the centre of a stable, divinely ordained world, required fundamental revision in light of the widespread destruction and chaos throughout the known world. Temple inscriptions from this period reflect increased emphasis on protective deities and defensive magical practices, while artistic representations show greater attention to fortifications and military preparations. The settlement of captured sea peoples within Egypt itself created new cultural dynamics that would influence Egyptian society for centuries. These populations brought distinct crafting techniques, particularly in metallurgy and pottery production, that gradually influenced Egyptian material culture. Their military expertise proved valuable for Egyptian commanders, who incorporated sea people's tactical innovations into standard Egyptian military doctrine. However, their presence also created potential security concerns, as these communities maintained distinct identities and could potentially serve as bases for future enemy operations. The transformation of Mediterranean trade networks following the Bronze Age collapse forced Egypt to develop new commercial relationships and trading strategies. Traditional partners like the Mycenaean Greeks and Hittite merchants had disappeared, while new groups like the Phoenicians began establishing maritime trading networks that would eventually challenge Egyptian commercial dominance. The pharaoh's administrators worked to establish relationships with these emerging powers while protecting Egyptian interests in remaining trade routes. Ramesses III's later years witnessed continued pressure from various directions, with Libyan tribes resuming their attacks on Egypt's western borders and Nubian vassals asserting greater independence in the south. The pharaoh's military resources, depleted by the massive campaigns against the Sea Peoples, proved insufficient to address all these challenges simultaneously. Egyptian forces achieved limited successes in individual campaigns, but could not restore the comprehensive imperial control that had characterized earlier periods of the New Kingdom. The assassination of Ramesses III around 1155 BC, the result of a palace conspiracy involving royal wives and court officials, symbolized the internal decay that accompanied external military pressures. The conspiracy, documented in judicial papyri that survived from the subsequent trials, revealed deep divisions within the royal court and growing dissatisfaction with the pharaoh's military policies. The successful elimination of the pharaoh demonstrated that even the most fundamental institutions of Egyptian monarchy had been weakened by the ongoing crisis. The death of Ramesses I around 1077 BC marked the end of unified pharaonic authority that had governed Egypt for over 15 centuries. The last ruler of the 20th dynasty died in Memphis, while actual control over southern Egypt rested with Herihor, the high priest of Amun at Thebes, who had assumed royal prerogatives, including the right to enclose his name in cartouches and date official documents to his own regnal years. This unprecedented division of royal authority between the nominal pharaoh in the north and the Theban priesthood in the south established a pattern of political fragmentation that would characterize Egyptian governance for the next 4 centuries. The emergence of dual authority centers reflected fundamental changes in Egypt's economic and administrative structures that had developed during the later New Kingdom. The Theban priesthood had accumulated enormous wealth through temple endowments, foreign tribute, and control over Nubian gold mines, creating an independent power base that rivaled royal authority. The priests controlled vast agricultural estates throughout Upper Egypt, maintained their own military forces, and conducted diplomatic relations with Nubian rulers without reference to the northern court. By Ramesses Thum's final years, the high priest of Amun effectively governed all territory south of Memphis as an autonomous ruler. Smendes, who established the 21st dynasty at Tanis around 1077 BC, inherited control over Lower Egypt and the Delta region, but lacked the resources to challenge Theban independence. The new pharaoh ruled from Tanis rather than the traditional capitals of Memphis or Thebes, reflecting both the practical limitations of his authority and the strategic importance of the northeastern delta for defending against Asiatic invasions. Tanis had served as a military base during the Ramesside period, its location near the Plusiac branch of the Nile providing access to Mediterranean trade routes, while maintaining defensive positions against potential threats from Palestine. The archaeological remains at Tanis reveal the reduced circumstances of 21st dynasty pharaohs compared to their New Kingdom predecessors. The royal tombs, constructed within the temple precinct rather than in separate necropolises, utilised recycled blocks and architectural elements from earlier monuments. Susens I, who ruled from approximately 1047 to 1001 BZ, was buried in a silver coffin placed within a granite sarcophagus originally carved for a 19th dynasty official. His funerary equipment, while rich in precious metals, lacked the artistic sophistication and monumental scale that had characterized royal burials during Egypt's imperial period. The Theban rulers maintained the fiction of subservience to the Tanite pharaohs through carefully crafted diplomatic protocols that acknowledged northern supremacy while preserving southern autonomy. Official documents from Thebes dated events to both the high priest's tenure and the reigning pharaoh's regnal years, creating a complex chronological system that reflected the political reality of divided authority. Marriage alliances between the royal families of Tanis and the priestly dynasties of Thebes provided additional legitimacy for this arrangement, while preventing open conflict between the two power centres. Pinudjam I, who served as high priest of Amun from approximately 1070 to 1032 BZ, exemplified the evolution of Theban authority during this period. Initially appointed by Smendes as a royal representative, Pinudjam gradually assumed full pharaonic titles and prerogatives, including the construction of royal monuments and the performance of religious ceremonies traditionally reserved for the pharaoh. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu incorporated architectural elements and decorative programs that explicitly claimed royal status, while his mummy, discovered in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, received burial treatment identical to that accorded legitimate pharaohs. The economic foundation of this divided authority rested on the control of specific revenue sources that had sustained Egyptian prosperity during the imperial period. The Tanite pharaohs controlled the delta's agricultural production, Mediterranean trade routes, and whatever remained of Egypt's Asiatic territories, while the Theban priesthood managed Upper Egyptian agriculture, Nubian gold extraction, and the extensive temple estates that generated substantial annual revenues. This division created two competing economic systems within Egypt, each capable of sustaining independent political authority, but neither possessing the resources necessary to reunify the kingdom by force. The gradual infiltration of Libyan populations into the Delta region during the late New Kingdom accelerated under the weakened central authority of the 21st dynasty. These weren't violent invasions, but systematic settlement processes involving Libyan tribal groups who had served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies and gradually established permanent communities throughout Lower Egypt. The Meshwesh and Libu tribes, originally from the western desert regions, brought distinct cultural practices, military traditions and political organisations that would fundamentally alter Egyptian society. Libyan military organisation differed significantly from traditional Egyptian systems, emphasising tribal loyalty and personal relationships between warriors and their chiefs, rather than the bureaucratic hierarchies that had characterized pharaonic armies. Libyan warriors fought with distinctive weapons, including curved swords, small round shields, and composite bows, while their leaders wore elaborate feathered headdresses and ornamental clothing that distinguished them from Egyptian officials. These military traditions proved highly effective in the decentralized political environment of the Third Intermediate Period, where personal loyalty and military prowess often determined political success more than administrative competence or religious authority. The rise of Shoshenq around 945 BC marked the beginning of Libyan political dominance in Egypt, though his accession represented the culmination of gradual processes rather than sudden conquest. Shoshenq belonged to a Libyan family that had served Egyptian pharaohs for several generations, accumulating wealth and political connections through military service and strategic marriages with Egyptian noble families. His uncle, Osorkon the Elder, had briefly ruled as pharaoh during the late 21st dynasty, establishing precedents for Libyan participation in royal succession that Shoshenq would exploit more successfully. The 22nd dynasty established by Shoshenq represented a synthesis of Libyan and Egyptian political traditions that created new forms of governance adapted to Egypt's changed circumstances. Shoshenq maintained traditional pharaonic titles and religious ceremonies while incorporating Libyan tribal structures into his administration. He appointed family members to key positions throughout Egypt, creating a network of related rulers who governed major cities and provinces as semi-autonomous vassals, rather than appointed officials subject to central authority. Shoshenq's military campaigns in Palestine around 925 BC demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Libyan Egyptian power. His forces successfully captured numerous cities throughout the former Egyptian Empire, including Jerusalem, where they plundered Solomon's temple and extracted tribute from the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The campaign reliefs at Karnak depict over 150 conquered cities and towns, suggesting the scale of Egyptian military operations and the temporary restoration of imperial authority in the Levant. However, these conquests proved ephemeral as Shoshenq lacked the administrative infrastructure necessary to maintain permanent control over distant territories. Egyptian forces withdrew after extracting tribute and plunder, leaving local rulers to resume their independence once the immediate military threat disappeared. The campaign's primary achievement was the demonstration of Egyptian military capability and the extraction of wealth that temporarily strengthened the pharaoh's position within Egypt itself. Internal structure of Libyan Egyptian governance reflected the decentralized nature of tribal political organization. Shoshenq appointed his sons and close relatives as rulers of major Egyptian cities, creating a system of family-based authority that resembled feudal arrangements more than traditional pharaonic administration. Osorkon, his elder son, received appointment as High Priest of Amun at Thebes, while other family members governed Memphis, Heracleopolis, and provincial centres throughout Egypt. This system initially provided stability by eliminating conflicts between competing power centres, but it contained inherent weaknesses that would eventually fragment Egyptian unity even further. The hereditary nature of these appointments meant that subsequent generations possessed legitimate claims to their territories regardless of their competence or loyalty to central authority. As family relationships became more distant and local interests diverged from royal policies, the system gradually evolved into genuine political fragmentation rather than decentralized administration. The 23rd dynasty, which emerged around 818 BC, represented the breakdown of even this limited unity, as multiple Libyan families asserted independent claims to pharaonic authority. Pedubasta established his capital at Leontopolis in the central delta, while maintaining control over Memphis and other strategic locations. Simultaneously, other Libyan rulers in Heracleopolis, Hermopolis, and provincial centres began using royal titles and dating official documents to their own regnal years, creating a situation where multiple pharaohs ruled simultaneously in different parts of Egypt. The multiplication of royal authority created unprecedented confusion in Egyptian political and religious life. Traditional concepts of pharaonic divinity, which had always assumed a single legitimate ruler serving as the earthly representative of the gods, required fundamental revision when multiple individuals claimed identical divine status. Temple inscriptions from this period reveal the practical difficulties this created, with priests uncertain which pharaohs' names to include in official ceremonies and religious texts. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Egypt demonstrates the material consequences of this political fragmentation. Construction projects became smaller and more localized, reflecting the reduced resources available to individual rulers. The great temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor received only minor additions and repairs, while provincial temples often fell into disrepair as local rulers prioritized military expenditures over religious construction. Artistic quality declined significantly, with royal monuments displaying crude workmanship and simplified iconographic programs that reflected reduced access to skilled craftsmen and precious materials. The economic disruption caused by political fragmentation extended beyond construction projects to affect Egypt's fundamental productive capacity. The Nile flood monitoring system, which had operated continuously since the Old Kingdom to predict agricultural yields and coordinate irrigation projects, broke down as competing authorities failed to maintain the network of nilometers and communication systems. Local rulers focused on short-term revenue extraction rather than long-term agricultural development, leading to the deterioration of irrigation infrastructure and reduced crop yields. Trade relationships with foreign partners suffered similar disruption as Egyptian merchants could no longer guarantee safe passage through territories controlled by competing pharaohs. The traditional trade routes that connected Upper and Lower Egypt required passage through multiple political jurisdictions, each demanding customs payments and providing uncertain security guarantees. Foreign traders increasingly bypassed Egyptian intermediaries, establishing direct relationships with producers in Nubia, Palestine and other regions that had previously been accessed through Egyptian commercial networks. The loss of Nubian tribute represented a particularly severe blow to Egyptian finances, as the gold mines and exotic products of the southern territories had provided substantial revenues throughout the New Kingdom and early Third Intermediate period. Nubian rulers gradually asserted independence from Egyptian authority, initially maintaining nominal allegiance while retaining increasing portions of gold production for their own use. By the 8th century BC, Nubian kingdoms had achieved complete independence and began expanding northward into Egyptian territory. The 24th dynasty, established by Tefnacht around 727 BC in the western delta city of Sais, represented an attempt to restore unified Egyptian authority through military conquest of competing pharaohs. Tefnacht assembled a coalition of delta rulers and launched campaigns against the Libyan pharaohs of Memphis and Heracleopolis, achieving initial successes that suggested the possibility of reunification under Site leadership. His forces utilized iron weapons and military techniques learned from contact with Assyrian and other Near Eastern armies, providing technological advantages over traditional Egyptian bronze armaments. However, Tefnacht's reunification efforts were interrupted by the intervention of Kushite forces under Pia, ruler of the Kingdom of Kush centered at Napata near the Fourth Cataract. Pia's invasion of Egypt around 720 BC represented the reversal of traditional power relationships between Egypt and Nubia, as the southern kingdom had developed superior military organization and economic resources during Egypt's period of fragmentation. The Kushite ruler claimed legitimate authority over Egypt as the heir to pharaonic traditions that the northern rulers had allegedly abandoned. The fragmentation of Egypt during the Third Intermediate period created opportunities for external intervention that would have been impossible during periods of unified pharaonic authority. Assyrian forces under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors conducted regular campaigns in Palestine and Syria, gradually extending their influence toward Egyptian borders. The weakened Egyptian kingdoms proved incapable of effective resistance to Assyrian expansion, with some rulers even seeking Assyrian protection against their Egyptian rivals. The cultural impact of political fragmentation extended beyond immediate administrative and economic consequences, to affect Egyptian religious practices and intellectual traditions. The breakdown of centralized authority eliminated the unified educational system that had trained scribes and officials in standardized procedures and knowledge. Regional variations in administrative practices, legal traditions, and religious ceremonies developed as local rulers adapted traditional Egyptian institutions to their specific circumstances and cultural backgrounds. The preservation of Egyptian textual traditions became increasingly problematic as competing royal courts lacked the resources to maintain comprehensive libraries and scriptoria. Many important religious and literary texts survived only in fragmentary form or disappeared entirely during this period, representing a significant loss of cultural knowledge that accumulated over millennia. The few texts that continued to be copied often contained errors and variations that reflected the reduced educational standards and cultural continuity of the fragmented kingdoms. The political chaos that had consumed Egypt for over 3 centuries created an unexpected opportunity for the kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata near the 4th cataract of the Nile. While Egyptian pharaohs fought among themselves for control of diminishing territories, Kushite rulers had systematically consolidated their power throughout the southern Nile Valley, developing military capabilities and administrative structures that would soon prove superior to those of their northern neighbours. The Kushite conquest of Egypt represented not merely another episode in the Third Intermediate Period's succession of competing dynasties, but a fundamental reversal of the traditional relationship between Egypt and Nubia that had existed since the Middle Kingdom. Kashta, who ruled Kush from approximately 760 to 747 BC, initiated the gradual Kushite expansion into Egyptian territory through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering that exploited the divisions among competing Egyptian rulers. His forces first occupied the region around Elephantine and Aswan, establishing control over the traditional border between Egypt and Nubia while maintaining diplomatic relations with the Theban priesthood. The Kushite king's daughter, Amenertis I, received appointment as god's wife of Amun at Thebes, a position that provided the Kushites with legitimate religious authority over Upper Egypt and access to the enormous wealth of the Amun temple complex. The appointment of Amenertis I represented a masterful political strategy that utilized traditional Egyptian religious institutions to legitimize Kushite authority. The god's wife of Amun had emerged during the Third Intermediate Period as one of the most powerful religious positions in Egypt, controlling vast temple estates and serving as the earthly consort of the god Amun. The position's holders were required to remain celibate, ensuring that their wealth and authority would pass to adopted successors rather than biological heirs, creating opportunities for political manipulation that Kashta exploited effectively. Piye, who succeeded his father Kashta around 747 BC, inherited a strategic situation that positioned Kush to intervene decisively in Egyptian affairs. The northern pharaohs continued their internecine conflicts, with Tefnacht of Sais attempting to reunify the Delta region while facing resistance from established Libyan rulers in Memphis and Heracleopolis. Piye's initial response to these northern developments appeared cautious, as he consolidated Kushite control over Upper Egypt and strengthened his military forces before committing to major campaigns beyond the traditional borders of his kingdom. The Kushite military organization that Piye inherited and expanded represented a synthesis of traditional Nubian warrior traditions, with advanced military technologies acquired through contact with Assyrian, Egyptian, and other Near Eastern armies. Kushite forces utilized iron weapons extensively, providing significant advantages over the bronze armaments that still equipped many Egyptian units. Their cavalry units, mounted on horses bred in the grasslands south of the 5th Cataract, possessed superior mobility and tactical flexibility compared to the chariot-based forces that remained standard in Egyptian armies. Kushite archers, trained from childhood in the use of powerful composite bows, had maintained their reputation as the finest bowmen in the ancient world since the Old Kingdom period. These warriors could accurately strike targets at ranges exceeding 200 meters, while their arrows, tipped with iron points and fletched with vulture feathers, possess sufficient penetrating power to pierce bronze armour and wooden shields. Pi's armies included thousands of these elite archers, organised in specialised units that could provide devastating supporting fire for infantry assaults or independent harassment of enemy formations. The religious ideology that justified Kushite expansion into Egypt drew upon centuries of cultural interaction between the two kingdoms, presenting the Kushite rulers as the legitimate heirs to pharaonic authority who would restore proper religious observances that the northern rulers had allegedly abandoned. Pa claimed direct divine appointment by Amun-Ra, whose primary cult centre at Jebel Bakal near Napata had served as a major religious site since the New Kingdom period. The Kushite king's inscriptions emphasised his role as the restorer of traditional Egyptian religious practices and the protector of temple estates that had suffered under the competing northern pharaohs. The Great Stela of Pir, discovered at Jebel Bakal and containing over 150 lines of hieroglyphic text, provides extraordinary detail about the Kushite conquest of Egypt and reveals the complex military and diplomatic strategies that Pir employed. The inscription describes how reports reached the Kushite court about Tefnacht's expansion throughout the delta and his threats to the independence of Upper Egyptian cities that had acknowledged Kushite suzerainty. Pir's initial response involved dispatching military commanders with instructions to halt Tefnacht's advance, while the king completed religious ceremonies at Napata. The first phase of Kushite military intervention focused on securing control over Middle Egypt, where several cities had submitted to Tefnacht's authority under pressure from his expanding coalition. Hermopolis, governed by Namlot, who had initially maintained independence from both northern and southern powers, became a crucial strategic objective due to its location controlling river traffic between Upper and Lower Egypt. The city's massive mud brick walls, reinforced with stone foundations and protected by a series of defensive towers, presented formidable obstacles to besieging forces. Pir's forces employed sophisticated siege techniques that demonstrated their familiarity with contemporary military engineering practices. Kushite engineers constructed massive earthwork ramps against Hermopolis's walls, while specialised units used bronze-tipped rams to breach the fortifications at vulnerable points. The siege lasted several months, during which Kushite forces systematically eliminated the city's external defences and cut off supply routes that connected Hermopolis with Tefnacht's forces in the north. The surrender of Hermopolis provided Pa with a strategic base for further operations, while demonstrating the effectiveness of Kushite military organisation to other Egyptian rulers. Namlot's submission included not only the city itself, but also substantial tribute payments consisting of gold, silver, horses and cattle that strengthened Pir's resources for continued campaigning. The Kushite king's treatment of the defeated ruler, who retained his position under Kushite suzerainty, established patterns of clemency and administrative continuity that would characterise the entire conquest. Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt and the key to controlling the entire Nile Valley, represented Pir's primary strategic objective during the final phase of his campaign. The city's enormous walls, constructed and reinforced over millennia, enclosed an area of approximately 25 square kilometres and housed a population exceeding 100,000 inhabitants. The Fortress of the White Wall, Memphis's primary defensive complex, featured multiple concentric walls with heights reaching 15 metres and thicknesses of up to 8 metres, while the harbour facilities provided access to both river and canal transportation networks. The Siege of Memphis tested Kushite military capabilities to their limits, as the city's defenders possessed adequate supplies for extended resistance and could potentially receive reinforcement from Tefnacht's remaining allies in the delta. Pir's engineers faced the challenge of breaching fortifications that had withstood numerous attacks throughout Egyptian history, while his logistical specialists managed supply lines extending over 1,000 kilometres from the Kushite homeland. The Kushite king's personal participation in the siege, described in detail on his victory stela, included direct reconnaissance of the city's defences and consultation with his military commanders, about optimal assault strategies. The successful capture of Memphis resulted from a coordinated attack that combined frontal assaults on the land-facing walls with amphibious operations against the harbour district. Kushite forces constructed a fleet of assault boats capable of carrying armed warriors directly against the city's river-facing fortifications, while simultaneously launching major attacks against the primary gates to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces. The final assault began before dawn, with Kushite archers providing covering fire as infantry units scaled the walls using rope ladders and grappling hooks. The fall of Memphis effectively ended organised resistance to Kushite expansion, as the remaining Delta rulers lacked the military resources necessary to challenge Pierre's now dominant position. Tefnut himself submitted to Kushite authority, travelling to Memphis to perform the traditional ceremonies of surrender that included prostration before the Kushite king and the payment of substantial tribute. The submission ceremony, depicted in relief sculptures at Jebel Barkal, shows Tefnut approaching Pierre's throne with his hands raised in supplication, while Kushite officials record the tribute payments and oath of allegiance. Pi's administrative arrangements following his military victory demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Egyptian governmental traditions and practical recognition of the challenges involved in governing such vast territories from the distant Kushite capital. Rather than attempting to replace existing administrative structures entirely, the Kushite king confirmed most local rulers in their positions, while establishing oversight mechanisms that ensured their continued loyalty. Kushite officials received appointments to key positions in major cities, while Egyptian administrators retained responsibility for routine governmental functions. The religious dimension of Kushite rule in Egypt required careful balance between traditional Egyptian practices and the distinct religious traditions that had developed in Kush over the preceding centuries. Pi and his successors presented themselves as pharaohs in the traditional Egyptian sense, adopting full royal titularies that emphasized their roles as sons of Ra and beloved of Amun. However, their religious practices incorporated Kushite elements that reflected the southern kingdom's cultural distinctiveness, including the prominent role of royal women in religious ceremonies and the emphasis on Amun of Napata as the supreme manifestation of the god. The construction projects undertaken by Kushite rulers throughout Egypt demonstrated their commitment to pharaonic traditions, while showcasing the resources available to their administration. Pi initiated restoration work at numerous temples that had suffered neglect during the political fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period, including major projects at Karnak, Luxor, and provincial temple complexes throughout Upper Egypt. These restoration efforts involved not merely repairs to existing structures, but significant additions and modifications that reflected Kushite artistic preferences and religious priorities. The artistic style developed under Kushite patronage represented a conscious revival of Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom Egyptian traditions, combined with distinctively Nubian elements that created a unique synthesis. Kushite royal sculptures featured the traditional pharaonic regalia and poses while incorporating facial features and body proportions that reflected the ruler's Nubian ancestry. The famous granite statues of Taharqa discovered at various Egyptian sites demonstrate this artistic fusion, showing the king wearing the traditional double crown of Egypt while his facial features clearly indicate his southern origins. Shabaka, who succeeded Pi around 716 BC, consolidated Kushite control over Egypt while facing the growing threat of Assyrian expansion in the Near East. The new Kushite pharaoh established his primary residence at Memphis, rather than maintaining court at the distant Napata, reflecting the practical necessities of governing Egypt directly while remaining accessible to his northern territories. Shabaka's reign marked the full integration of Egypt into the Kushite kingdom, with administrative procedures and religious practices standardized throughout the combined realm. The Shabaka stone, a basalt slab containing the text of the Memphite theology that Shabaka ordered copied from an ancient papyrus manuscript, exemplifies the Kushite commitment to preserving and reviving Egyptian intellectual traditions. The king's scribes claimed that the original document had been found in poor condition and required immediate copying to prevent its complete loss, suggesting systematic efforts to recover and preserve Egyptian textual heritage that had suffered during the preceding period of political fragmentation. Shabaka's military policies focused primarily on defensive preparations against the expanding Assyrian Empire, which had conquered most of the Levant and posed direct threats to Egyptian security. The Kushite pharaoh strengthened frontier fortifications along the traditional Egyptian borders while establishing diplomatic relationships with Palestinian and Syrian rulers who sought Egyptian support against Assyrian expansion. These diplomatic initiatives represented the revival of Egyptian influence in the Near East after centuries of withdrawal and isolation. The Assyrian threat materialized during the reign of Taharqa, who ruled from approximately 690 to 664 BC and represented the pinnacle of Kushite power in Egypt. Taharqa inherited a unified kingdom that controlled territory from the Sixth Cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea, with administrative systems that effectively integrated Egyptian and Kushite governmental traditions. His early reign witnessed extensive construction projects throughout Egypt, including major additions to the temple complexes at Karnak and Kawa, while his military forces maintained Egyptian influence throughout Nubia and the Levant. The massive temple construction projects undertaken during Taharqa's reign demonstrated the enormous resources available to the Kushite pharaohs and their commitment to traditional Egyptian religious practices. The king's additions to the Karnak temple complex included a series of monumental columns in the Great Court, each standing over 15 meters high and decorated with elaborate relief carvings depicting the king performing religious ceremonies before various deities. The construction techniques employed in these projects utilized both Egyptian and Kushite engineering traditions, creating architectural innovations that influenced subsequent building practices. Taharqa's pyramid at Nuri, constructed according to traditional Kushite burial practices while incorporating Egyptian architectural elements, symbolized the cultural synthesis that characterized the 25th dynasty. The pyramid's steep angle and relatively modest size reflected Kushite preferences, while the associated mortuary temple and causeway followed Egyptian architectural conventions. The burial chamber contained grave goods that combined Egyptian and Kushite artistic traditions, including shabti figures carved in traditional Egyptian styles, alongside distinctively Nubian ceremonial objects. The Assyrian invasion of Egypt under Esarhaddon in 674 BC marked the beginning of the end for Kushite rule, as the Northern Empire possessed military technologies and organizational capabilities that exceeded even the reformed Egyptian armies. Esarhaddon's forces included iron-armed infantry, cavalry units, and siege engines that provided decisive advantages over traditional Egyptian defensive strategies. The Assyrian king's initial campaign achieved limited success, capturing several delta cities before Taharqa's counterattack forced a temporary Assyrian withdrawal. The decisive Assyrian campaign occurred in 671 BC, when Esarhaddon's forces achieved a complete victory over Taharqa's armies and captured Memphis after a brief siege. The Kushite pharaoh escaped southward to Thebes, where he maintained resistance for several years while Assyrian forces consolidated their control over Lower Egypt. The Assyrian administrative system, which appointed local Egyptian rulers as vassals while maintaining military garrisons in major cities, proved more effective than previous foreign occupations in preventing Egyptian resurgence. Taharqa's attempts to regain control of northern Egypt continued until his death in 664 BC, with limited successes that demonstrated continued Kushite military capabilities, while revealing the fundamental impossibility of maintaining Egyptian unity against superior Assyrian forces. The Kushite pharaoh's final campaigns achieved temporary reoccupation of Memphis and other strategic locations, but these victories proved ephemeral as Assyrian reinforcements systematically eliminated Egyptian resistance and established permanent control over the northern territories. The death of Taharqa in 664 BC marked the end of effective Kushite resistance to Assyrian expansion, but the Northern Empire's conquest of Egypt represented far more than another territorial acquisition in their vast dominion. For the first time since the Hyksos invasions of the Second Intermediate Period, foreign armies had successfully penetrated the Nile Delta, breached the ancient fortifications of Memphis, and established administrative control over the heartland of pharaonic civilization. The Assyrian achievement required overcoming military obstacles that had protected Egypt for over a millennium, utilizing siege techniques and organizational capabilities that fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout the ancient Near East. Esarhaddon's initial invasion in 674 BC had demonstrated both Assyrian capabilities and the formidable challenges involved in conquering Egypt. The Assyrian king's forces advanced through the Sinai Peninsula with a massive logistical train that included specialized equipment for siege warfare, portable bridges for crossing waterways, and supply wagons capable of sustaining extended campaigns in hostile territory. Assyrian engineers had constructed a series of fortified supply depots along the invasion route, each positioned to provide water, provisions, and replacement equipment for the advancing armies while serving as defensive positions against potential Egyptian counterattacks. The Assyrian military machine that approached Egypt's borders represented the most sophisticated military organization in the ancient world, incorporating technological innovations and tactical doctrines developed through centuries of continuous warfare throughout Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. Iron weapons equipped every Assyrian soldier, from the heavy infantry who formed the core of siege operations to the light cavalry units that provided reconnaissance and harassment capabilities. Assyrian smiths had perfected techniques for producing iron arrowheads, spear points, and sword blades that maintained sharp edges longer than bronze equivalents while possessing superior penetrating power against enemy armour and shields. The siege engines that accompanied Esarhaddon's invasion force included massive battering rams mounted on wheeled platforms, siege towers capable of overtopping Egyptian fortifications, and specialized equipment for undermining defensive walls. These machines represented engineering achievements that exceeded anything available to Egyptian defenders, incorporating mechanical principles and construction techniques that Assyrian military engineers had refined through decades of siege warfare against fortified cities throughout their empire. The largest battering rams required teams of up to 100 men to operate effectively, their bronze-reinforced heads capable of shattering stone blocks and wooden gates that had previously provided adequate protection against conventional attacks. Taharka's defensive preparations revealed both the strengths and limitations of Egyptian military adaptation during the Kushite period. The pharaoh had strengthened frontier fortifications throughout the Delta region, constructing new defensive works at Pelusium and other strategic locations, while upgrading existing fortresses with additional walls and defensive towers. Egyptian engineers had incorporated some iron weapons into their arsenals and adopted cavalry units modelled on Assyrian examples, but these innovations remained limited in scope and could not offset the fundamental technological and organisational advantages possessed by their enemies. The decisive campaign of 671 BC began with Esarhaddon's systematic reduction of Egyptian frontier positions, utilising siege techniques that overwhelmed defenders who lacked adequate preparation for such intensive attacks. The fortress at Pelusium, which controlled the primary invasion route through this eastern delta, fell after a siege lasting only 12 days, its massive walls breached by concentrated battering ram attacks supported by archer units that eliminated defenders from the ramparts. The rapid collapse of this key defensive position opened the entire delta region to Assyrian penetration and demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional Egyptian defensive strategies against superior siege technology. The Assyrian advance toward Memphis proceeded with methodical efficiency that reflected careful planning and extensive intelligence gathering about Egyptian defensive capabilities. Esarhaddon's forces moved in multiple columns that converged on strategic objectives while maintaining communication through signal systems and mounted messengers. The Assyrian king personally commanded the central column that advanced directly toward Memphis. while subordinate commanders led flanking forces that captured secondary cities and eliminated potential bases for Egyptian counterattacks. The siege of Memphis in 671 BC represented the climax of Assyrian military achievement in Egypt, as the ancient capital's fortifications had withstood numerous attacks throughout Egyptian history and symbolised the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The city's walls, constructed and reinforced over millennia, presented formidable obstacles that required the full deployment of Assyrian siege capabilities. The White Wall Fortress, Memphis's primary defensive complex, featured multiple concentric barriers with towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, while the city's location at the apex of the Nile Delta provided natural defensive advantages that complicated attacking operations. Esarhaddon's siege operations demonstrated the systematic approach that characterized Assyrian military doctrine, beginning with the complete encirclement of Memphis to prevent reinforcement or escape by defending forces. Assyrian engineers constructed a series of siege camps around the city's perimeter, each fortified with earthworks and palisades that protected the besiegers while providing bases for assault operations. The largest camp, positioned opposite the city's main gate, housed the Assyrian king's headquarters and the primary siege engines that would conduct the decisive attacks against Memphis's defences. The assault phase began with intensive archer bombardments designed to clear Egyptian defenders from the walls and towers that protected the city's gates. Thousands of Assyrian archers, positioned in prepared positions within effective range of the fortifications, maintained continuous fire that forced Egyptian defenders to seek cover and prevented effective resistance to the advancing siege engines. The arrows, tipped with iron points and fired from powerful composite bows, possessed sufficient force to penetrate wooden shields and leather armour, while their sheer volume created psychological pressure that undermined defender morale. The battering ram attacks that followed the archer bombardments targeted specific weak points in Memphis's defences that Assyrian engineers had identified through careful reconnaissance. The massive siege engines, protected by bronze-plated shields and operated by experienced crews, systematically hammered against gate structures and wall sections until the ancient masonry began to crack and crumble. The rhythmic pounding of the rams, audible throughout the city, created a constant reminder of Assyrian power, while the gradual destruction of defensive barriers demonstrated the futility of continued resistance. The final assault on Memphis began before dawn on the 15th day of the siege, with Assyrian forces launching coordinated attacks against multiple breach points while maintaining pressure along the entire perimeter to prevent the concentration of the Egyptian defensive forces. The breakthrough occurred at the northern gate, where repeated battering ram attacks had weakened the stone foundation sufficiently to allow Assyrian infantry to storm through the collapsed barriers. The elite Assyrian guard units, armed with iron swords and bronze-reinforced shields, fought their way into the city's streets, while archers provided covering fire from the walls they had captured. Taharka's escape from Memphis as Assyrian forces entered the city marked the effective end of Kushite authority in northern Egypt, though the pharaoh's withdrawal to Thebes ensured continued resistance in Upper Egypt. The Kushite king's retreat southward, with the remnants of his army, preserved the core of Egyptian military strength, while abandoning the strategic positions necessary to defend the kingdom's northern territories. This decision reflected both the practical impossibility of defending Memphis against superior Assyrian forces and the strategic calculation that resistance from upper Egyptian bases might eventually enable the recovery of lost territories. The Assyrian occupation system implemented in conquered Egyptian territories represented a sophisticated approach to imperial administration that balanced direct control with local autonomy to minimize resistance while maximizing resource extraction. Esarhaddon appointed Egyptian nobles as provincial governors under Assyrian supervision, creating administrative arrangements that maintained local governmental structures while ensuring loyalty to Assyrian authority. These appointments required elaborate ceremonies in which Egyptian officials swore binding oaths of allegiance to the Assyrian king while receiving symbols of their delegated authority. Necho I, appointed as Assyrian governor of Sais and the Western Delta, exemplified the collaborative relationships that Esarhaddon established with cooperative Egyptian leaders. The former pharaoh of the 24th dynasty had initially resisted Assyrian expansion, but submitted following the fall of Memphis, demonstrating pragmatic acceptance of the new political reality. His appointment as governor provided Assyrian administration with local knowledge and established relationships while offering Egyptian elites opportunities to maintain their positions under foreign rule. The tribute system imposed on occupied Egyptian territories extracted enormous wealth that flowed eastward to the Assyrian heartland, while providing local administrators with sufficient resources to maintain governmental functions. Annual tribute assessments included specific quantities of gold, silver, agricultural products, and manufactured goods, calculated according to each region's productive capacity and economic resources. Egyptian scribes working under Assyrian supervision conducted detailed surveys of agricultural lands, craft workshops, and commercial activities to establish accurate baseline assessments for tribute calculations. The administrative records from this period, preserved in cuneiform tablets discovered at Nineveh and other Assyrian sites, reveal the systematic approach that characterized imperial resource extraction. These documents list individual Egyptian cities and their tribute obligations, recording payments in precise weights and measures that reflect sophisticated accounting procedures. The tribute from Memphis alone included 1,000 talents of silver annually, along with specified quantities of linen, papyrus, and exotic products that demonstrated Egypt's continued economic productivity under foreign administration. Assyrian military garrisons established throughout occupied Egypt ensured compliance with tribute obligations while deterring potential rebellions against imperial authority. These forces, stationed in fortified compounds within major cities, maintained constant readiness for military operations while serving as visible symbols of Assyrian power. The garrison at Memphis housed approximately 2,000 soldiers, including infantry units, cavalry squadrons, and specialized siege personnel equipped with the latest military technology available to Assyrian forces. The cultural impact of Assyrian occupation extended beyond immediate administrative and economic changes to influence Egyptian religious practices and intellectual traditions. Assyrian officials generally tolerated traditional Egyptian religious observances while ensuring that temple activities supported imperial authority rather than encouraging resistance. The appointment of pro-Assyrian priests to major religious positions eliminated potential centres of opposition, while maintaining the ceremonial functions that legitimize governmental authority in Egyptian society. Tantamani's accession to the Kushite throne following Taharka's death in 664 BC initiated the final phase of Egyptian resistance to Assyrian occupation. The new Kushite pharaoh inherited control over Upper Egypt and Nubia, along with military forces that remained capable of challenging Assyrian authority in southern territories. Tantamani's early reign focused on consolidating Kushite positions around Thebes, while preparing for campaigns to recover the northern territories lost during his predecessor's conflicts with Esarhaddon. The Kushite military preparations for renewed warfare against Assyrian forces involved significant organizational reforms and technological improvements designed to address the tactical deficiencies that had contributed to earlier defeats. Tantamani's commanders expanded their iron weapon production capabilities while adopting siege techniques learned through observation of Assyrian methods during previous campaigns. The Kushite army incorporated additional cavalry units and archer formations that provided greater tactical flexibility in confronting Assyrian military formations. Tantamani's invasion of northern Egypt in 663 BC achieved initial successes that demonstrated continued Kushite military capabilities, while revealing the limitations of Assyrian garrison forces when confronting major enemy offensives. The Kushite pharaoh's forces advanced rapidly through Upper Egypt, capturing Aswan, Edfu, and other strategic positions before concentrating for an assault on Memphis. The speed of this advance caught Assyrian commanders unprepared for major military operations, as their forces had been configured for occupation duties rather than intensive combat against organised enemy armies. The recapture of Memphis by Tantamani's forces represented a significant psychological victory that encouraged Egyptian resistance throughout the occupied territories, while demonstrating that Assyrian military dominance was not absolute. The Kushite assault on the ancient capital utilised siege techniques learned from previous Assyrian operations, including coordinated attacks against multiple breach points and the systematic elimination of defensive positions through concentrated archer fire. The success of these operations vindicated Kushite military reforms while providing momentum for further advances into the Delta region. The Assyrian response to Tantamani's invasion involved the deployment of substantially larger military forces under the direct command of Ashurbanipal, who had succeeded his father Esarhaddon as Assyrian king. The new monarch's military preparations included the mobilization of elite units from throughout the Assyrian Empire, creating an invasion force that exceeded the size and capabilities of previous expeditions to Egypt. Ashurbanipal's personal participation in the campaign demonstrated the strategic importance that Assyrian leadership attached to maintaining control over Egyptian territories and resources. The decisive confrontation between Assyrian and Kushite forces occurred near Memphis in early 663 BC, resulting in a complete Assyrian victory that eliminated effective Kushite resistance in northern Egypt. Tantamani's army, despite its recent successes and improved organisation, proved unable to withstand the concentrated assault of Ashurbanipal's forces. The battle demonstrated the continuing technological and tactical advantages possessed by Assyrian military units, particularly their superior siege capabilities and coordinated infantry-cavalry operations. Tantamani's retreat southward following this defeat marked the beginning of systematic Assyrian pursuit operations designed to eliminate Kushite military capabilities permanently. Ashurbanipal's forces advanced up the Nile Valley, capturing Egyptian cities that had supported Kushite resistance while pursuing the fleeing pharaoh toward his upper Egyptian strongholds. The Assyrian advance proceeded methodically, with each captured city subjected to systematic plundering that extracted wealth, while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to imperial authority. The systematic destruction of Thebes by Ashurbanipal's forces in 663 BC created a power vacuum throughout Egypt that would ultimately enable the emergence of the most remarkable revival in the kingdom's long history. While Kushite resistance collapsed under Assyrian military pressure and Tantamani retreated permanently to Nubia, the Assyrian Empire itself faced mounting challenges throughout its vast territories that would soon force a strategic withdrawal from Egyptian affairs. The Scythe princes of the Western Delta, who had served as Assyrian vassals since Esarhaddon's conquest, recognized this opportunity and began positioning themselves to restore native Egyptian rule through careful political maneuvering and military preparation. Psamtik I, son of the Assyrian-appointed governor Necho I, inherited control over Sais and the surrounding territories around 664 BC under circumstances that appeared to offer little prospect for independence. Assyrian garrisons maintained control over strategic positions throughout northern Egypt, while tribute obligations continued to drain Egyptian resources eastward to Nineveh. However, the new Scythe ruler possessed advantages that his predecessors had lacked, including detailed knowledge of Assyrian administrative methods, established relationships with local Egyptian elites, and access to Mediterranean trade networks that provided alternative sources of military and economic support. The gradual erosion of Assyrian control over Egypt began with the empire's increasing preoccupation with rebellions and external threats in other regions. Babylonian resistance under Shamash-shum-ukin required substantial military resources, while Elamite invasions of Mesopotamia forced Ashurbanipal to redeploy troops from distant provinces to defend the imperial heartland. These strategic pressures created opportunities for Egyptian autonomy that Psamtik I exploited through careful timing and diplomatic skill, rather than direct military confrontation. Psamtik's initial steps toward independence involved the systematic recruitment of foreign mercenaries who could provide military capabilities superior to traditional Egyptian forces while remaining loyal to their employers rather than external powers. Greek warriors from Ionia and Caria, displaced by Persian expansion in Anatolia, offered military expertise and advanced weaponry in exchange for land grants and regular payment. These mercenaries brought iron weapons, advanced siege techniques, and tactical knowledge gained through service in various Mediterranean conflicts, providing Psamtik with military assets that rivaled Assyrian capabilities. The establishment of mercenary settlements at strategic locations throughout the delta created a network of fortified positions that could defend against potential Assyrian retaliation, while serving as bases for further military operations. The largest mercenary colony, established at Daphnaia near the eastern frontier, housed approximately 3,000 Greek and Carian warriors, along with their families and support personnel. These settlements operated under special legal arrangements that preserved the mercenaries' traditional customs while integrating them into Egyptian administrative structures through land grants and tax exemptions. Greek military organisation differed fundamentally from both Egyptian and Assyrian systems, emphasising heavily armed infantry formations that fought in close coordination rather than the mixed cavalry-infantry arrangements typical of Near Eastern armies. The hoplite phalanx, with its overlapping shields and long spears, provided defensive capabilities that could withstand cavalry charges while maintaining sufficient mobility for offensive operations. These tactical innovations proved particularly effective in the flat terrain of the Delta region, where traditional cavalry advantages were minimised and disciplined infantry formations could dominate battlefield engagements. Carian mercenaries brought different but complementary military skills, particularly in naval warfare and amphibious operations, that would prove crucial for controlling the Mediterranean coastline and Nile Delta waterways. Carian ships, constructed with advanced joinery techniques and equipped with bronze rams for naval combat, provided Psamtik with maritime capabilities that exceeded traditional Egyptian river vessels. These naval forces could intercept Assyrian supply ships, conduct raids against enemy coastal positions, and transport troops rapidly between strategic locations throughout the Delta region. The diplomatic dimension of Psamtik I's independence strategy involved careful cultivation of relationships with other powers that opposed Assyrian dominance while avoiding premature commitments that might provoke retaliation before Egyptian military preparations were complete. The Lydian kingdom under Gyges provided financial support and additional mercenary forces, while maintaining official neutrality that avoided direct confrontation with Assyrian power. These relationships created a network of mutual support that strengthened Egyptian resistance without triggering the massive military response that open alliance might have provoked. Psamtik's gradual assertion of independence began with administrative reforms that eliminated Assyrian oversight while maintaining the appearance of continued vassalage. Egyptian officials replaced Assyrian supervisors in key positions throughout the government bureaucracy, while tribute payments were reduced through claims of economic difficulties and natural disasters that made full compliance impossible. These changes proceeded incrementally over several years, creating new realities on the ground while avoiding dramatic gestures that might have prompted immediate military intervention. The economic foundation of Site independence rested on the revival of Mediterranean trade relationships that had been disrupted during the Assyrian occupation and preceding periods of political fragmentation. Psamtik I's administration actively courted Greek merchants who could provide access to silver, iron, and other strategic materials while offering Egyptian products, including grain, linen, and papyrus to Mediterranean markets. These commercial relationships generated revenues that funded military expansion while creating economic incentives for continued Greek support of Egyptian independence. The establishment of permanent Greek trading facilities at Naucratis around 650 BC marked a crucial development in Egyptian commercial policy that would have lasting consequences for the kingdom's economic and cultural development. Unlike previous foreign trading arrangements that operated through Egyptian intermediaries, the Naucratis colony allowed Greek merchants to establish permanent residence and conduct business according to their own legal traditions while remaining subject to Egyptian taxation and administrative oversight. This arrangement attracted substantial Greek investment while providing the Egyptian government with reliable revenue sources and access to Mediterranean commercial networks. Naucratis developed rapidly into a major commercial centre that rivaled traditional Egyptian trading cities in volume and diversity of economic activity. The city's harbour facilities, constructed with Greek engineering expertise and Egyptian labour, could accommodate the largest Mediterranean merchant vessels while providing secure storage for valuable cargoes. Greek craftsmen established workshops that produced goods combining Egyptian materials with Mediterranean artistic traditions, creating products that appeal to customers throughout the ancient world while generating substantial profits for both Greek entrepreneurs and the Egyptian treasury. The cultural impact of Greek settlement in Egypt extended beyond immediate commercial benefits to influence Egyptian artistic expression, architectural design, and intellectual development. Greek sculptors working in Egyptian workshops introduced new artistic techniques while adapting to local aesthetic preferences, creating distinctive hybrid styles that combined Greek naturalism with traditional Egyptian symbolic content. The famous sculptures from this period demonstrate sophisticated technical skill in rendering human anatomy and facial expressions, while maintaining the hierarchical compositions and religious iconography that characterized pharaonic art. Egyptian architects incorporated Greek architectural elements into traditional building designs, particularly in the construction of temple complexes and administrative buildings that required large interior spaces and sophisticated structural engineering. The use of Greek column designs and construction techniques enabled the creation of larger unsupported spans, while maintaining the massive scale that Egyptian religious architecture demanded. These innovations appeared most prominently in the temple additions and renovations that Psamtik I sponsored throughout Egypt as part of his broader cultural revival program. The religious dimension of the site of Renaissance involved systematic efforts to restore traditional Egyptian religious practices while incorporating innovations that reflected the kingdom's changed circumstances and international connections. Psamtik I sponsored major restoration projects at temple complexes throughout Egypt, repairing damage from the Assyrian occupation while adding new structures that demonstrated royal piety and economic prosperity. These projects employed thousands of skilled craftsmen and labourers while consuming enormous quantities of stone, metal, and other materials that stimulated economic activity throughout the kingdom. The deliberate revival of Old Kingdom artistic and architectural styles during the Said period represented more than mere antiquarian interest, but constituted a sophisticated political strategy that emphasized the continuity of pharaonic traditions and the legitimacy of native Egyptian rule. Site artists studied and copied sculptures, reliefs, and architectural elements from pyramids and temples dating to the 4th and 5th dynasties, reproducing ancient artistic conventions with remarkable accuracy while adapting them to contemporary requirements. This conscious archaism created visual connections between the site revival and Egypt's most glorious historical periods, while distinguishing native Egyptian culture from foreign influences. The pyramid texts and other ancient religious literature received renewed attention during the Said period as priests and scholars worked to restore traditional religious knowledge that had been neglected during preceding centuries of political disruption. These efforts involved the systematic copying of ancient manuscripts, the restoration of damaged temple libraries, and the training of new generations of priests in traditional religious practices and ceremonial procedures. The resulting religious revival strengthened popular support for the Said dynasty, while providing ideological justification for resistance to foreign domination. Psamtik I's military campaigns to reunify Egypt under Said authority proceeded systematically from north to south, utilizing the superior military capabilities provided by Greek and Carian mercenaries while avoiding confrontations that might have attracted Assyrian intervention. The conquest of Memphis around 656 BC marked the crucial breakthrough that established site control over the strategic centre of Egypt while demonstrating the effectiveness of mercenary forces against traditional Egyptian defensive arrangements. The city's capture required extensive siege operations that showcased Greek military engineering capabilities, while the subsequent administrative arrangements revealed Psamtik's sophisticated approach to governing conquered territories. The siege of Memphis demonstrated the tactical superiority of Greek military methods over traditional Egyptian defensive strategies, as Psamtik's hoplite formations systematically reduced the city's fortifications through coordinated assaults supported by advanced siege equipment. Greek engineers constructed massive battering rams and siege towers that exceeded the capabilities of previous Egyptian military technology, while Carian naval forces controlled the river approaches that had traditionally provided Memphis with supply lines and escape routes for defending forces. The integration of Upper Egypt into the expanding Saite kingdom required more complex political arrangements due to the continued influence of the Theban priesthood and the need to eliminate remaining Kushite loyalties without triggering widespread resistance. Psamtik's solution involved the appointment of his daughter Nitocris as god's wife of Amun at Thebes, utilizing the same religious position that had provided the Kushites with legitimate authority over southern Egypt. This appointment required elaborate negotiations with the existing priesthood and substantial financial commitments to temple restoration projects that demonstrated royal support for traditional religious institutions. The ceremony installing Nitocris as god's wife of Amun represented one of the most significant religious events of the Saite period, involving processions, offerings, and ritual performances that emphasized the restoration of proper religious order under native Egyptian rule. The new god's wife brought substantial endowments that funded temple operations, while her presence at Thebes provided the Saite dynasty with direct control over the religious and economic resources of Upper Egypt. This arrangement eliminated the potential for southern autonomy that had characterized previous periods of Egyptian political fragmentation, while maintaining the religious traditions that legitimize pharaonic authority. The economic recovery that accompanied Saite political reunification reflected both the elimination of internal conflicts that had disrupted productive activities and the positive effects of renewed Mediterranean trade relationships. Agricultural production increased as irrigation systems received necessary maintenance and expansion, while craft industries benefited from access to imported raw materials and export markets that had been unavailable during previous decades. The revival of traditional trade routes connecting Egypt with Nubia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean created commercial networks that generated substantial revenues for the royal treasury, while providing employment for thousands of merchants, craftsmen, and transport workers. Psamtik I's foreign policy initiatives demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the changing strategic situation throughout the Near East as Assyrian power declined and new threats emerged from expanding Persian influence in the east. The pharaoh's support for Babylonian independence movements against Assyrian rule created opportunities for Egyptian influence in Mesopotamian affairs, while avoiding direct military commitments that might have exceeded Egyptian capabilities. These diplomatic relationships provided Egypt with allies against potential Persian expansion, while maintaining the flexibility necessary to adapt to rapidly changing international circumstances. The military campaigns that Psamtik then conducted in the Levant during the 620 SBC mark the restoration of Egyptian influence in territories that had been lost during the Assyrian occupation and preceding periods of internal weakness. Egyptian forces, spearheaded by Greek and Carian mercenaries and supported by traditional Egyptian units, successfully captured several Palestinian cities while establishing tributary relationships with local rulers who sought protection against Babylonian and Assyrian pressures. These campaigns demonstrated that Egypt had recovered sufficient military strength to project power beyond its traditional borders, while the revenues extracted from conquered territories helped fund continued military expansion. The siege of Ashdod, which lasted 29 years according to Herodotus, exemplified both the persistence and limitations of site military capabilities during this period of renewed Egyptian expansion. The prolonged nature of the siege reflected the formidable defensive capabilities of Philistine cities, while demonstrating Egyptian determination to restore control over strategic coastal positions. The eventual capture of Ashdod provided Egypt with a crucial naval base for Mediterranean operations, while eliminating a potential threat to Egyptian commercial activities along the Levantine coast. The death of Psamtik III around 610 BC marked the end of the most successful phase of site restoration, but his successors inherited a kingdom that had regained its position as a major regional power capable of influencing events throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The military and administrative foundations established during his 34-year reign provided Egypt with resources and organisational capabilities that would enable continued resistance to foreign domination for another century. However, the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great created an existential threat that would ultimately prove insurmountable for even the most capable Egyptian rulers. Necho II, who succeeded his father around 610 BC, inherited both the opportunities and challenges created by the collapse of Assyrian power throughout the Near East. The Babylonian conquest of Nineveh in 612 BC had eliminated Egypt's primary regional rival, while creating new strategic possibilities for Egyptian expansion into territories that had been under Assyrian control for generations. Necho's military campaigns in the Levant during the 590 SBC achieved significant territorial gains, with Egyptian forces capturing Gaza, Ashkelon and advancing as far north as the Euphrates River, before encountering serious Babylonian resistance. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC represented the decisive confrontation between Egyptian and Babylonian forces for control of Syrian territories, resulting in a catastrophic defeat that eliminated Egyptian influence throughout the Levant and demonstrated the superior military capabilities of Nebuchadnezzar II's armies. Egyptian forces, despite their Greek mercenary units and improved equipment, proved unable to withstand the coordinated assault of Babylonian infantry and cavalry formations supported by advanced siege engines. The battle's aftermath saw thousands of Egyptian casualties and the complete collapse of the territorial gains that Necho had achieved during his earlier campaigns. The retreat of Egyptian forces from the Levant following the Carchemish disaster forced a fundamental reassessment of site strategic priorities and military capabilities. Necho II's administration redirected resources toward defensive preparations along Egypt's eastern frontier while pursuing diplomatic initiatives designed to prevent further Babylonian expansion into Egyptian territory. The construction of new fortifications at Pelusium and other strategic locations consumed enormous financial resources, while the maintenance of enlarged mercenary forces strained the royal treasury beyond sustainable levels. Psamtik II's brief reign from 595 to 589 BC focused primarily on consolidating Egyptian control over Nubian territories that had remained under Kushite influence since the Assyrian withdrawal. The pharaoh's military campaigns in the south achieved limited successes against Kushite forces, while demonstrating Egypt's continued military capabilities in regions where geographic advantages favoured Egyptian operations. The systematic destruction of Kushite monuments and inscriptions throughout Upper Egypt reflected site determination to eliminate all traces of foreign rule, while establishing permanent Egyptian control over the valuable gold-producing regions of Nubia. The reign of Apries, who ruled from 589 to 570 BC, witnessed the most serious challenges to site authority since the dynasty's establishment, as internal rebellions coincided with external military pressures that tested Egyptian administrative and military capabilities to their limits. The pharaoh's support for Judean resistance against Babylonian expansion provoked Nebuchadnezzar II's invasion of Egypt around 582 BC, resulting in limited territorial losses and the imposition of tributary relationships that compromised Egyptian independence. Simultaneously, military failures in Cyrenaica against Greek colonists undermined royal prestige, while creating opportunities for domestic opposition to challenge Apri's authority. The rebellion led by Amasis, a military commander of humble origins who had gained prominence through service in the Nubian campaigns, represented a fundamental challenge to the established social and political order that had characterized Saite rule. Amasis's support came primarily from native Egyptian soldiers and provincial administrators who resented the privileges accorded to Greek mercenaries and foreign advisors, while his military success against royal forces demonstrated the limitations of mercenary loyalty when confronted with popular opposition. The civil war that followed lasted several years and devastated large portions of the Delta region before Amasis achieved final victory around 570 BC. The accession of Amasis marked a significant shift in Saite policies toward foreign populations and international relationships, as the new pharaoh sought to balance Egyptian nationalist sentiments with the practical necessities of maintaining military effectiveness and commercial prosperity. Greek mercenaries retained their military roles and land grants, but faced increased restrictions on their activities and reduced political influence in governmental decision-making. The consolidation of Greek commercial activities at Naucratis reflected this new approach, concentrating foreign merchants in a single location where their activities could be monitored and controlled more effectively. Amasis's foreign policy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the changing strategic situation throughout the Near East as Persian power expanded westward under Cyrus the Great and his successors. The pharaoh's diplomatic initiatives included alliance negotiations with Lydian and Babylonian rulers who faced similar threats from Persian expansion, while Egyptian naval forces provided limited support for Greek city-states resisting Persian conquest in Anatolia. These relationships created a network of mutual defense agreements that might have provided effective resistance to Persian expansion if they had been implemented more systematically and with greater military coordination. The Persian conquest of Lydia in 546 BC eliminated one of Egypt's primary allies, while demonstrating the overwhelming military superiority that Cyrus's forces possessed over traditional Near Eastern armies. The speed and completeness of Lydian collapse shocked contemporary observers throughout the region and forced Egyptian strategic planners to reassess their defensive preparations and alliance relationships. Amasis's response involved intensified military preparations along Egypt's eastern frontier, while diplomatic efforts sought to delay Persian attention toward Egyptian territories through tribute payments and expressions of nominal submission. The Persian military machine that approached Egypt's borders under Cambyses II represented the culmination of military innovations and organizational developments that had enabled rapid conquest throughout the Near East. Persian forces combined traditional Iranian cavalry units with infantry formations recruited from throughout their vast empire, creating diverse armies that could adapt to various tactical situations and geographic conditions. The incorporation of specialized units, including Scythian archers, Phoenician naval forces, and Mesopotamian siege engineers, provided Persian commanders with capabilities that exceeded those available to any potential opponents. Persian administrative methods, refined through decades of governing diverse populations throughout their empire, offered conquered peoples opportunities for local autonomy and cultural preservation that contrasted favourably with the harsh assimilationist policies pursued by previous imperial powers. The Persian system of satrapies provided provincial governors with substantial authority, while maintaining central oversight through royal inspectors and communication networks that ensured loyalty to imperial policies. This administrative flexibility enabled rapid integration of conquered territories, while minimizing resistance from local populations, who could maintain their traditional customs and religious practices. The death of Amasis in 526 BC occurred at the most critical moment in Egyptian history since the Hyksos invasions, as Persian forces under Cambyses II had completed their preparations for the conquest of Egypt and were advancing through the Sinai Peninsula toward the Delta frontier. Psamtik III, who inherited the throne as a young and inexperienced ruler, faced the impossible task of defending Egypt against the most powerful military force in the ancient world, with resources that had been strained by decades of military preparation and internal conflict. The Persian invasion force that entered Egypt in 525 BC included approximately 50,000 combat troops, supported by extensive logistical units and specialized personnel recruited from throughout the Persian Empire. Cambyses II personally commanded the expedition, demonstrating the strategic importance that Persian leadership attached to Egyptian conquest and the integration of the Nile Valley into their imperial system. The invasion army included elite Persian cavalry units, Median infantry formations, Phoenician naval forces, and Arab auxiliaries who provided crucial knowledge of desert warfare and local geographic conditions. The Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC represented the decisive confrontation between Egyptian and Persian forces that would determine the fate of pharaonic independence. Psamtik III had concentrated the available Egyptian military forces at this strategic frontier position, utilising the fortress's defensive advantages while positioning his armies to intercept the Persian advance before it could penetrate into the Delta heartland. The Egyptian force included approximately 30,000 troops combining traditional Egyptian units with Greek and Carian mercenaries, supported by whatever naval vessels could be assembled for operations in the coastal lagoons and waterways surrounding Pelusium. The tactical arrangements for the Battle of Pelusium revealed both the strengths and fundamental weaknesses of Egyptian military organisation when confronted with Persian combined arms operations. Egyptian forces occupied prepared defensive positions that maximised their advantages in archery and provided protection against cavalry attacks, while Greek mercenary phalanxes formed the core of Egyptian resistance to Persian infantry assaults. However, the diversity of Persian tactical capabilities and their superior coordination between different military units created overwhelming pressure that Egyptian defenders could not sustain indefinitely. Persian siege operations against Pelusium demonstrated the advanced military engineering capabilities that had enabled their rapid conquest throughout the Near East. Persian engineers constructed massive earthwork ramps that enabled their forces to assault the fortress walls directly, while specialised units undermined defensive positions through systematic tunnelling operations. The coordination between siege operations and field army manoeuvres prevented Egyptian forces from receiving reinforcement or conducting effective sorties against Persian positions. The breakthrough came when Persian cavalry units, supported by Arab auxiliaries familiar with local terrain, discovered passages through the marshy ground that enabled flanking attacks against Egyptian defensive positions. These tactical manoeuvres forced Egyptian commanders to redeploy their forces to meet threats from multiple directions, while Persian infantry maintained pressure against the primary defensive lines. The collapse of Egyptian resistance occurred when Greek mercenary units, recognising the hopelessness of their situation, began negotiating separate surrenders that left Egyptian forces without their most effective combat units. Psamtik III's capture during the final phase of the battle eliminated the last symbol of Egyptian independence, while providing Cambyses II with the legitimacy necessary to claim pharaonic authority. The young pharaoh's treatment as an honoured prisoner rather than a conquered enemy reflected Persian diplomatic sophistication and their understanding of Egyptian political traditions. However, Psamtik's subsequent execution, allegedly for plotting rebellion against Persian rule, demonstrated the limits of Persian tolerance and the definitive end of native Egyptian royal authority. The Persian administrative system implemented in Egypt following Cambyses II's conquest represented a sophisticated adaptation of imperial governance methods to Egyptian conditions and traditions. Egypt became the sixth satrapy of the Persian Empire, with its satrap appointed directly by the Persian king and responsible for tribute collection, military recruitment, and the maintenance of internal order. The tribute assessment imposed on Egypt, reportedly 700 talents of silver annually, along with specified quantities of grain and other products, reflected the kingdom's enormous economic value to the Persian Empire, while ensuring that Egyptian resources contributed to imperial military and administrative operations throughout the Near East. Cambyses II's religious policies in Egypt demonstrated initial respect for traditional Egyptian institutions and practices that facilitated the integration of pharaonic administrative systems into Persian imperial governance. The Persian king adopted pharaonic titles and participated in traditional religious ceremonies while maintaining Egyptian priests in their positions and continuing temple construction projects that had been initiated under Saite rule. This approach minimized resistance from Egyptian religious authorities while preserving the ideological foundations of governmental legitimacy that had sustained pharaonic rule for millennia. The administrative personnel appointed to govern Egypt under Persian rule included both Persian officials and Egyptian administrators, who possessed essential knowledge of local conditions and governmental procedures. The satrap Ariandis, who governed Egypt during the early Persian period, relied heavily on Egyptian scribes and provincial governors who had served under the Saite dynasty, while implementing Persian oversight mechanisms that ensured loyalty to imperial authority. This administrative synthesis preserved Egyptian governmental efficiency while integrating the kingdom into Persian imperial communication and command systems. Persian military arrangements in Egypt balanced the need for adequate garrison forces to maintain internal security with the demands of imperial military operations throughout the Near East that required Egyptian troops and resources. Persian forces stationed in Egypt included approximately 10,000 troops distributed among fortified positions at Memphis, Pelusium, and other strategic locations, while Egyptian military units received integration into Persian armies that conducted campaigns in Greece, Central Asia, and other frontier regions. These arrangements provided career opportunities for Egyptian soldiers, while ensuring their loyalty to Persian rather than Egyptian interests. The economic integration of Egypt into the Persian Empire created new commercial opportunities while subjecting Egyptian producers to imperial taxation and resource extraction requirements that reduced domestic prosperity. Egyptian agricultural production, particularly grain cultivation in the Delta region, received systematic development to meet imperial supply requirements for Persian military operations and urban populations throughout the Near East. However, the tribute obligations and taxation levels imposed by Persian administration exceeded the revenue extraction that had characterized previous periods of Egyptian history. The reign of Darius I, who became Persian king in 522 BC, marked a period of intensive administrative reform and cultural accommodation that strengthened Persian control over Egypt while demonstrating sophisticated understanding of Egyptian traditions and governmental requirements. Darius's legal codification project included provisions for Egyptian law and religious practices that preserved local autonomy in matters not affecting imperial interests, while his construction projects in Egypt demonstrated royal support for traditional pharaonic institutions and architectural traditions. The construction of a canal connecting the Nile River with the Red Sea represented one of Darius II's most ambitious projects in Egypt, requiring enormous expenditures of labour and resources while providing significant strategic and commercial advantages for Persian imperial operations. The canal, which followed approximately the same route as the modern Suez Canal, enabled direct maritime communication between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea while facilitating the transport of Egyptian products to Persian markets in Mesopotamia and Central Asia. The project employed thousands of Egyptian workers under Persian supervision, while incorporating advanced engineering techniques developed throughout the Persian Empire. Persian religious policies under Darius I demonstrated remarkable tolerance and accommodation toward Egyptian religious traditions, with the Persian king sponsoring temple construction projects and participating in traditional pharaonic religious ceremonies. The Temple of Amun at Hybis in the Karga Oasis, constructed entirely during the Persian period, incorporated traditional Egyptian architectural and decorative elements, while including inscriptions that presented Darius as a legitimate pharaoh performing proper religious duties. This synthesis of Persian imperial authority with Egyptian religious traditions provided ideological justification for Persian rule, while maintaining the ceremonial functions that legitimize governmental authority in Egyptian society. The administrative efficiency achieved under Persian rule enabled Egypt to contribute substantially to imperial military operations throughout the Persian Empire, with Egyptian naval forces participating in Persian campaigns against Greece, while Egyptian agricultural production supported Persian armies operating in distant theatres. The Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC included substantial Egyptian contingents, with Phoenician-built warships manned by Egyptian crews forming a significant portion of Xerxes I's naval forces. These military contributions demonstrated Egypt's continued strategic importance to Persian imperial operations, while providing Egyptian personnel with opportunities for advancement within the imperial military hierarchy. However, the intensification of Persian resource extraction under Xerxes I created growing tensions within Egyptian society as tribute obligations increased, while Persian religious policies became less accommodating toward traditional Egyptian practices. Xerxes' destruction of Egyptian temples and religious monuments reflected a fundamental shift in Persian attitudes toward local traditions, as imperial authorities prioritized resource extraction and political control over the cultural accommodation that had characterized earlier Persian rule. These policy changes created conditions for Egyptian resistance that would eventually culminate in major rebellions against Persian authority. The first significant Egyptian revolt against Persian rule occurred around 486 BC under the leadership of a native Egyptian named Kabash, who claimed pharaonic titles and attempted to restore native Egyptian authority throughout the Nile Valley. The rebellion achieved initial successes in Upper Egypt, where Persian garrison forces were relatively weak, while Kabash's forces utilized traditional Egyptian military tactics adapted to guerrilla warfare conditions that minimized Persian advantages in conventional battle. However, the revolt lacked sufficient resources and foreign support to challenge Persian control over strategic positions in Lower Egypt, and ultimately collapsed when Persian reinforcements arrived from other parts of the empire. The major Egyptian rebellion that began around 460 BC under the leadership of Inaros, a Libyan prince who claimed descent from earlier pharaohs, represented the most serious challenge to Persian authority since the original conquest 40 years earlier. Inaros assembled a coalition of Egyptian forces and Greek mercenaries that achieved significant military successes against Persian garrison troops, while establishing control over substantial portions of the Delta region. The rebellion received support from Athens, which provided naval forces and military advisors as part of their broader conflict with the Persian Empire throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The siege of Memphis during Inaros' rebellion demonstrated both the military capabilities of Egyptian resistance forces and the ultimate limitations of their resources when confronted with the full weight of Persian imperial power. Egyptian and Greek forces successfully captured the ancient capital and maintained control for several years, while Persian forces controlled only the fortress district known as the White Wall. However, the arrival of Persian reinforcements under the command of Megabyzus, along with Phoenician naval forces that controlled the Nile Delta waterways, gradually shifted the strategic balance against the Egyptian rebels. The collapse of Inaros' rebellion around 454 BC resulted from the systematic Persian elimination of Egyptian supply lines and the destruction of Athenian naval support that had provided crucial military assistance to the rebellion. Megabyzus' forces utilized superior logistical capabilities and coordination between land and naval operations to isolate Egyptian resistance forces while preventing foreign reinforcement of rebel positions. The capture and execution of Inaros marked the definitive end of this phase of Egyptian resistance, while Persian reprisals eliminated much of the native Egyptian leadership that might have organized future rebellions. Persian administrative reforms following the suppression of Inaros' rebellion involved the implementation of harsher control measures and increased tribute obligations that reflected imperial determination to prevent future Egyptian resistance. The appointment of Persian officials to positions previously held by Egyptian administrators eliminated potential centres of opposition, while the establishment of additional garrison forces ensured rapid response to any signs of renewed rebellion. These measures succeeded in maintaining Persian control over Egypt for the remainder of the 5th century BC, though they create underlying tensions that would eventually contribute to the temporary restoration of Egyptian independence under Amyrtaeus. The death of Darius II in 405 BC created a succession crisis that temporarily weakened Persian control throughout the empire's western territories, providing Egyptian rebels with their most promising opportunity for independence since the failed revolt of Inaros 50 years earlier. Amyrtaeus, a descendant of the Sete royal family who had maintained a precarious existence in the Delta marshlands, recognised that Persian attention would be focused on securing the succession of Artaxerxes II against his brother Cyrus the Younger. The Egyptian prince had spent decades building networks of support among native Egyptian priests, disaffected Persian officials and Libyan tribal leaders who controlled strategic positions throughout the western delta. Amyrtaeus's rebellion began not with dramatic military confrontations, but through systematic infiltration of Persian administrative positions and the gradual elimination of Persian garrison forces and isolated outposts. His supporters, many of whom held minor positions within the Persian administrative hierarchy, provided crucial intelligence about garrison strengths, supply schedules, and communication networks that enabled coordinated strikes against vulnerable Persian positions. The rebellion's initial successes occurred in the marshy regions of the western delta, where Persian cavalry units faced severe mobility restrictions, while Egyptian forces utilised traditional knowledge of waterways and seasonal flooding patterns to achieve tactical advantages. The capture of Mendes in 404 BC marked Amyrtaeus's transition from guerrilla leader to legitimate pharaoh, as the city's substantial population and strategic location provided the resources necessary to challenge Persian control over northern Egypt directly. The Persian garrison at Mendes, numbering approximately 800 troops, had been reduced by transfers to support Artaxerxes II's campaigns against Cyrus, leaving insufficient forces to defend the city's extensive fortifications against sustained attack. Egyptian forces utilised siege techniques learned from observing Persian operations during previous rebellions, including the construction of earthwork ramps and the systematic undermining of defensive walls through tunnelling operations. The administrative challenge of establishing legitimate governmental authority throughout Egypt required Amyrtaeus to balance traditional pharaonic institutions with practical accommodations to the changed circumstances created by over 80 years of Persian rule. Many Egyptian noble families had collaborated with Persian administration, accumulating wealth and administrative experience that made them valuable potential allies, while their previous loyalties created suspicions about their reliability. Amyrtaeus's solution involved the gradual integration of these families into his administration through marriage alliances and the confirmation of their property rights, while appointing trusted supporters to key military and religious positions. The restoration of traditional Egyptian religious practices under Amyrtaeus required extensive negotiations with temple priesthoods, who had adapted to Persian religious policies while maintaining their essential ceremonial functions. The pharaoh's coronation at Memphis involved elaborate ceremonies that emphasized the restoration of proper religious order, while incorporating innovations that reflected Egypt's changed circumstances. The participation of Greek mercenaries in traditional pharaonic ceremonies created unprecedented situations that required careful diplomatic management to maintain religious authenticity while acknowledging military realities. Persian efforts to suppress Amyrtaeus's rebellion initially proved ineffective due to the empire's preoccupation with the massive revolt of Cyrus the Younger and subsequent military campaigns throughout Anatolia and Mesopotamia. The satrap Artaphernes, responsible for Egyptian affairs, commanded insufficient forces to conduct major military operations, while his requests for reinforcements received low priority from imperial authorities, focused on more immediate threats to Persian heartland territories. This strategic neglect provided Amyrtaeus with crucial time to consolidate his control over Egyptian territory and establish administrative systems capable of sustaining prolonged resistance. The Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, which resulted in Cyrus the Younger's death and the collapse of his rebellion against Artaxerxes II, fundamentally altered the strategic situation throughout the Persian Empire by eliminating the primary threat to imperial stability, while freeing substantial military resources for operations against provincial rebellions. The famous retreat of the 10,000 Greek mercenaries who had supported Cyrus demonstrated both the military capabilities of professional Greek soldiers and their availability for employment by other powers seeking to challenge Persian authority. Amyrtaeus recognized these developments as both opportunity and threat, as Greek military expertise could strengthen Egyptian resistance, while increased Persian attention to Egyptian affairs posed existential dangers to his newly established kingdom. The diplomatic initiatives that Amyrtaeus pursued with Spartan and Athenian representatives revealed sophisticated understanding of Mediterranean political dynamics and the potential for Greek support against Persian expansion. Egyptian envoys offered substantial financial inducements for Greek military assistance, while emphasizing the strategic advantages that Egyptian independence could provide for Greek operations against Persian territories in Anatolia and the Levant. However, Greek city-states remained primarily focused on their internal conflicts and showed limited interest in sustained military commitments to distant Egyptian campaigns that offered uncertain prospects for success. Nepherites I, who established the 29th dynasty around 399 BC following Amyrtaeus' death under mysterious circumstances, inherited a kingdom that had achieved remarkable success in establishing independence, but faced mounting Persian pressure as imperial authorities prepared systematic campaigns to restore Egyptian tribute payments and strategic positions. The new pharaoh's power base centered on Mendes in the northern Delta region, where his family had accumulated substantial wealth through collaboration with Amyrtaeus' administration, while maintaining independent military forces capable of challenging rival claimants to pharaonic authority. The military reforms implemented under Nepherites I demonstrated careful study of Persian tactical methods and Greek military innovations that had proven effective in contemporary Mediterranean conflicts. Egyptian forces received training in Greek hoplite formations while maintaining traditional archery units that provided long-range capabilities superior to standard Greek armaments. The integration of Libyan cavalry units with Egyptian infantry created combined arms formations capable of tactical flexibility in various geographic conditions, while the establishment of permanent military colonies along strategic frontiers provided defensive depth against potential Persian invasions. Greek mercenary recruitment became a crucial component of Egyptian military policy under the 29th dynasty, as native Egyptian forces alone proved insufficient to resist Persian armies equipped with superior siege technology and supported by extensive logistical networks. Nepherites I's agents operated throughout the Greek world, offering competitive wages and land grants to experienced soldiers seeking employment opportunities in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. These recruitment efforts attracted approximately 10,000 Greek warriors to Egyptian service, including veterans of major battles who brought tactical knowledge and training expertise that significantly enhanced Egyptian military capabilities. The fortification program undertaken throughout Egypt during Nepherites' first reign reflected both increased resources available to the independent kingdom and realistic assessment of Persian military capabilities demonstrated in previous campaigns against rebellious provinces. New defensive works at Pelusium incorporated Greek engineering techniques with traditional Egyptian fortress design, creating layered defensive systems that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, while providing defenders with protected positions for archery and siege engine operations. The fortress walls, constructed with limestone blocks reinforced with bronze clamps, reached heights of 20 meters, while their thickness of 8 meters provided resistance against the most powerful battering rams available to Persian forces. Persian preparations for the reconquest of Egypt under Artaxerxes II involved systematic intelligence gathering and diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate Egyptian resistance while assembling overwhelming military forces for decisive campaigns. Persian agents operated throughout the eastern Mediterranean, offering substantial bribes to Greek city-states and mercenary commanders, who might otherwise provide assistance to Egyptian independence movements. Simultaneously, Persian diplomatic missions to Nubian kingdoms and Libyan tribal confederations sought to prevent Egyptian access to traditional sources of military support and exotic materials that had sustained pharaonic power throughout previous centuries. The first major Persian expedition against independent Egypt under Pharnabazus and Iphicrates in 385 BC demonstrated both the enormous military resources that the Persian Empire could deploy against rebellious provinces and the tactical challenges involved in conquering territories defended by competent military forces utilizing advanced defensive techniques. The Persian invasion force included approximately 80,000 troops combining traditional Persian units with Greek mercenaries, Phoenician naval forces, and specialized siege personnel recruited from throughout the empire. The expedition's logistical requirements necessitated the establishment of supply bases throughout the Levant, while Phoenician vessels transported heavy equipment and provisions to support extended siege operations. The Persian assault on Pelusium revealed the effectiveness of Egyptian defensive preparations while demonstrating the limitations of traditional siege techniques against well-designed fortifications defended by motivated garrison forces. Persian engineers constructed massive earthwork ramps against the fortress walls, while battering ram operations targeted the main gates and vulnerable wall sections identified through preliminary reconnaissance. However, Egyptian defenders utilized Greek fire techniques and concentrated archery to inflict severe casualties on Persian assault forces, while their strategic reserves conducted sorties that disrupted Persian siege operations and prevented the establishment of permanent breach positions. Iphicrates' tactical innovations during the Pelusium siege included the use of specialized assault troops equipped with longer spears and lighter armor that provided greater mobility in close combat situations while maintaining sufficient protection against Egyptian defensive weapons. These tactical reforms reflected Greek military developments during the 4th century BC that emphasized tactical flexibility over the rigid formations that had characterized earlier hoplite warfare. However, the coordination between Greek tactical innovations and traditional Persian military methods proved problematic, as different units operated according to incompatible command structures and tactical doctrines that prevented effective combined operations. The failure of the Persian expedition resulted primarily from logistical difficulties and coordination problems between diverse military units rather than Egyptian tactical superiority, though the siege's collapse after 6 months demonstrated the resilience of Egyptian defensive preparations and the effectiveness of Greek mercenary training programs. Persian forces withdrew from Egyptian territory after consuming their available supplies while failing to achieve breakthrough against Pelusium's defences, leaving Egyptian independence intact while demonstrating that Persian military dominance was not absolute when confronted with competent opposition utilising appropriate defensive strategies. Hakor, who ruled from 393 to 380 BC, represented the pinnacle of 29th dynasty achievement in consolidating Egyptian independence while building military capabilities sufficient to deter Persian reconquest attempts. His reign witnessed extensive diplomatic initiatives throughout the Mediterranean world that created networks of mutual support with Greek city-states, Cypriot kingdoms, and other powers seeking to limit Persian expansion. The pharaoh's agents established permanent diplomatic missions in Athens, Sparta, and other major Greek cities, while Egyptian financial support enabled Greek military operations against Persian territories in Anatolia and the Aegean Islands. The construction projects undertaken during Hakor's reign demonstrated both the economic prosperity achieved under independent rule and the strategic priorities that guided Egyptian resource allocation during this period of external threats. Temple restoration projects at Karnak and other major religious centres received substantial funding that employed thousands of skilled craftsmen while demonstrating royal piety and continuity with pharaonic traditions. However, the majority of royal expenditures focused on military infrastructure, including fortress construction, weapon production facilities, and the maintenance of enlarged mercenary forces that constituted Egypt's primary defence against Persian reconquest. Nectanebo I's accession around 380 BC marked the establishment of the 30th dynasty, which would prove to be the final period of native Egyptian rule in pharaonic history. The new pharaoh inherited a kingdom that had successfully maintained independence for over 20 years, while building military and administrative capabilities that rivaled those of major Mediterranean powers. However, Persian determination to restore Egyptian tribute payments and strategic positions had intensified under Artaxerxes II, who viewed Egyptian independence as an intolerable challenge to imperial authority that encouraged rebellions throughout the western provinces. The defensive strategy developed under Nectanebo I emphasized the concentration of Egyptian military forces in fortified positions that could withstand prolonged siege operations, while maintaining sufficient mobility to conduct counterattacks against Persian supply lines and isolated garrison forces. This approach required extensive coordination between regular Egyptian forces, Greek mercenary units, and allied contingents from Nubian and Libyan sources that provided specialized capabilities including cavalry formations and desert warfare expertise. The integration of these diverse military elements into coherent operational plans represented one of the most sophisticated military organizations achieved in Egyptian history. Persian military preparations under Pharnabazus for renewed campaigns against Egypt involved unprecedented resource allocation and strategic coordination that demonstrated imperial determination to eliminate Egyptian independence permanently. The Persian invasion force assembled in the Levant during 374 BC included over 200,000 troops, supported by extensive siege equipment, naval vessels, and logistical units capable of sustaining extended operations against fortified Egyptian positions. The expedition's scale exceeded previous Persian military operations in the region, while its careful preparation reflected lessons learned from earlier failures against Egyptian defensive systems. The Second Persian invasion of Egypt achieved initial successes against frontier positions that had been weakened by reduced garrison forces and inadequate maintenance of defensive works during the preceding years of relative peace. Persian forces captured several delta fortresses through coordinated siege operations that utilized advanced engineering techniques and overwhelming numerical superiority to overcome Egyptian resistance. However, the main Egyptian defensive positions at Memphis and other strategic locations remained intact, while Nectanebo I's forces conducted effective harassing operations against Persian supply convoys and isolated detachments. The ultimate failure of this Persian expedition resulted from seasonal flooding that disrupted Persian siege operations, while creating tactical advantages for Egyptian forces familiar with local geographic conditions and seasonal patterns. The Nile flood of 373 BC proved particularly severe, inundating Persian camps and siege equipment, while enabling Egyptian naval forces to conduct amphibious operations against Persian positions throughout the Delta region. Persian commanders, lacking adequate knowledge of Egyptian hydrographic conditions, had positioned their forces in areas subject to seasonal flooding, while their heavy equipment proved impossible to relocate rapidly when water levels rose unexpectedly. Teos, who succeeded Nectanebo I around 365 BC, pursued aggressive foreign policies that sought to exploit Persian difficulties throughout the empire, while building Egyptian influence in traditional spheres of pharaonic power. The pharaoh's military campaigns in the Levant achieved limited territorial gains, while his diplomatic initiatives created alliance relationships with rebellious Persian satraps and Greek city-states that provided mutual support against imperial authority. However, these ambitious policies required enormous financial expenditures that strained Egyptian resources while creating internal opposition from conservative factions who preferred defensive strategies focused on maintaining independence rather than territorial expansion. The military innovations introduced during Teos's reign included the systematic adoption of Greek siege techniques and the establishment of permanent naval bases capable of supporting extended Mediterranean operations. Egyptian engineers studied Greek and Persian fortress design while incorporating improvements that reflected local conditions and available materials. The resulting fortifications combined traditional Egyptian massive construction with Greek technical innovations, including improved gate systems, coordinated defensive towers, and underground facilities for storing supplies and housing garrison forces during extended siege operations. Nectanebo II's accession around 360 BC followed a brief civil war that demonstrated the internal tensions created by Teos's aggressive foreign policies and their associated financial burdens. The new pharaoh, who'd served as a military commander under his predecessor, inherited a kingdom that retained substantial military capabilities while facing mounting Persian pressure as Artaxerxes III consolidated imperial control throughout the western provinces. Nectanebo II's early policies emphasized defensive preparations and internal consolidation rather than territorial expansion, reflecting realistic assessment of Egyptian capabilities relative to the growing Persian threat. The building projects undertaken during Nectanebo II's reign represented the final flowering of pharaonic architectural achievement, combining traditional Egyptian monumental scale with technical innovations developed during the independence period. The pharaoh's additions to temple complexes at Philae, Edfu, and other locations demonstrated continued Egyptian mastery of stone construction techniques, while their decorative programs emphasized themes of divine protection and royal legitimacy that reflected contemporary political concerns. These projects employed thousands of skilled craftsmen while consuming enormous quantities of high-quality stone transported from quarries throughout Egypt and Nubia. The military preparations that dominated Nectanebo II's later reign involved systematic strengthening of Egyptian defensive positions, while diplomatic initiatives sought to delay Persian military operations through tribute payments and expressions of nominal submission. The pharaoh's agents negotiated temporary agreements that provided breathing space for continued military preparations, while avoiding immediate confrontation with Persian forces that had achieved decisive victories against other rebellious provinces. However, these diplomatic expedients could not indefinitely postpone the final Persian assault on Egyptian independence that Artaxerxes III was systematically preparing. The Persian invasion of 343 BC under Artaxerxes III represented the culmination of decades of imperial planning and resource accumulation designed to eliminate Egyptian independence permanently. The invasion force included over 300,000 troops combining Persian regular units with Greek mercenaries, Phoenician naval forces, and specialized contingents recruited from throughout the empire. The expedition's logistical support involved the establishment of supply bases throughout the Levant, while engineering units prepared siege equipment specifically designed to overcome Egyptian fortification systems that had successfully resisted previous Persian attacks. The systematic Persian advance through Egyptian territory demonstrated tactical coordination and strategic planning that exceeded previous imperial military operations in the region. Persian forces captured frontier positions through coordinated siege operations, while maintaining sufficient reserves to respond to Egyptian counterattacks and prevent the concentration of defensive forces at crucial strategic locations. The speed of Persian advancement prevented effective Egyptian coordination between isolated garrison forces, while the overwhelming scale of imperial military deployment eliminated possibilities for successful resistance through traditional defensive strategies. The final siege of Memphis marked the effective end of native Egyptian independence. As Nectanebo II's escape to Nubia, eliminated the last symbol of pharaonic authority, while Persian forces established complete control over Egyptian administrative and economic centres. The ancient capital's capture required extensive siege operations that demonstrated both Persian military capabilities and the continued strength of Egyptian fortification systems even in the face of overwhelming enemy superiority. The city's fall after 3 months of intensive siege operations provided Artaxerxes III with the symbolic victory necessary to claim legitimate pharaonic authority while eliminating organised Egyptian resistance to imperial rule. The second Persian occupation of Egypt under Artaxerxes III and his successor Darius III involved harsher administrative policies and increased tribute obligations that reflected imperial determination to prevent future rebellions while extracting maximum economic benefit from Egyptian territories. Persian officials replaced Egyptian administrators throughout the governmental hierarchy, while military garrisons received substantial reinforcement to ensure rapid suppression of any resistance activities. The systematic destruction of Egyptian fortifications and the deportation of potential resistance leaders eliminated the infrastructure and leadership that had sustained Egyptian independence for over 60 years. Persian cultural policies during the Second Occupation demonstrated reduced tolerance for Egyptian religious traditions and local customs compared to the earlier period of Persian rule under Darius I and his successors. The destruction of temple complexes and the confiscation of religious treasures reflected imperial priorities that emphasized resource extraction and political control over cultural accommodation. These harsh policies created widespread resentment among Egyptian populations, while eliminating the religious and cultural institutions that had provided ideological support for pharaonic authority throughout Egyptian history. The administrative efficiency achieved under the Second Persian occupation enabled systematic exploitation of Egyptian agricultural and mineral resources while preventing the accumulation of wealth that might have supported future independence movements. Tribute assessments increased substantially compared to earlier Persian rule, while new taxation systems extracted revenues from commercial activities and craft production that had previously remained largely exempt from imperial demands. These economic policies generated enormous wealth for the Persian treasury while reducing Egyptian prosperity to levels that eliminated possibilities for sustained resistance to imperial authority. Military recruitment policies under the Second Persian occupation involved the systematic conscription of Egyptian personnel for imperial military operations throughout the Persian Empire, while preventing the concentration of armed Egyptian forces within their homeland territories. Egyptian soldiers served in Persian armies operating in Central Asia, India, and Greece, while their families remained in Egypt as hostages, ensuring continued loyalty to imperial authority. These arrangements provided the Persian Empire with valuable military personnel while eliminating potential sources of armed resistance within Egyptian territory. The cultural impact of renewed Persian occupation extended beyond immediate administrative and economic consequences to affect Egyptian religious practices, artistic traditions, and intellectual development in ways that would influence the kingdom's subsequent history under Macedonian rule. The disruption of traditional educational systems and the deportation of skilled craftsmen eliminated much of the cultural continuity that had sustained Egyptian civilization throughout previous periods of foreign domination. The systematic destruction of libraries and archives resulted in the permanent loss of textual materials that had preserved Egyptian historical and religious knowledge for millennia. The systematic destruction of Egyptian independence under the Second Persian occupation had eliminated not merely political autonomy, but the fundamental cultural and administrative structures that had sustained pharaonic civilization for over 3 millennia. When Alexander III of Macedon approached Egypt's eastern frontier in 332 BC, he encountered a kingdom whose native institutions had been systematically dismantled, while Persian administrative control rested on military force rather than popular acceptance. The young Macedonian king's arrival represented not simply another change of foreign rulers, but the beginning of a transformation that would fundamentally alter Egypt's relationship with the broader Mediterranean world. while paradoxically preserving pharaonic traditions through their incorporation into Hellenistic royal ideology. Alexander's invasion force that crossed into Egypt from Gaza numbered approximately 35,000 troops, combining the veteran Macedonian phalanx formations that had conquered the Persian Empire with allied Greek contingents, Thracian cavalry units, and specialised siege personnel who had perfected their techniques during the systematic reduction of Persian strongholds throughout Anatolia and the Levant. The Macedonian military machine represented the culmination of Greek tactical innovations developed during the 4th century BC, featuring the sarissa-armed phalanx formations that provided unprecedented reach and striking power while maintaining the disciplined coordination that had characterized earlier hoplite warfare. Persian resistance to Alexander's advance into Egypt proved minimal, as Mazakes, the Persian satrap responsible for Egyptian administration, commanded insufficient forces to challenge Macedonian military superiority, while the Egyptian population demonstrated active hostility toward Persian rule that eliminated possibilities for effective collaboration between occupying forces and local administrators. The rapid collapse of Persian authority reflected both the overwhelming tactical advantages possessed by Macedonian forces and the fundamental illegitimacy of Persian rule in Egyptian eyes, following decades of harsh administrative policies and cultural suppression. The surrender of Pelusium without resistance provided Alexander with immediate access to the Nile Delta, while demonstrating the complete breakdown of Persian defensive preparations throughout the eastern frontier. The ancient fortress, which had successfully withstood numerous sieges throughout Egyptian history, opened its gates to Macedonian forces as Persian garrison troops either fled westward or negotiated individual surrenders that preserved their lives while eliminating organised resistance to Alexander's advance. The fortress's substantial military supplies and strategic position enabled rapid Macedonian penetration into the Egyptian heartland while providing secure bases for subsequent operations throughout the Delta region. Memphis surrendered to Alexander's forces without siege operations, as the city's Persian administrators recognized the futility of resistance against superior Macedonian military capabilities, while Egyptian priests and nobles actively welcomed the prospect of liberation from Persian rule. The ancient capital's submission provided Alexander with symbolic control over Egypt's traditional governmental centre, while its treasury, containing accumulated Persian tribute collections, supplied immediate financial resources for continued military operations and administrative reorganisation. The young king's entry into Memphis involved traditional pharaonic ceremonies that emphasised continuity with ancient Egyptian institutions, while establishing his legitimate authority over the conquered territory. Alexander's coronation as pharaoh at Memphis represented a crucial moment in the transformation of Egyptian political traditions, as the Macedonian king became the first foreign ruler to receive full pharaonic titles through traditional religious ceremonies rather than simple military conquest. The elaborate rituals conducted by Egyptian priests according to ancient protocols involved the symbolic marriage to Egypt through the goddess Isis, while the presentation of traditional pharaonic regalia, including the double crown, crook and flail, established Alexander's divine status according to Egyptian religious concepts. These ceremonies created unprecedented synthesis between Macedonian royal authority and pharaonic divine kingship that would provide the ideological foundation for subsequent Ptolemaic rule. The foundation of Alexandria in 331 BC marked Alexander's most lasting contribution to Egyptian civilization, as the new city's strategic location at the western edge of the Nile Delta provided optimal access to Mediterranean trade routes, while its planned urban design incorporated the most advanced Greek architectural and engineering concepts available in the contemporary world. Alexander personally selected the site following careful reconnaissance of the Egyptian coastline, choosing a location that combined natural harbour facilities with defensible terrain, while providing adequate fresh water supplies and connections to the Nile River system that would enable commercial access to Egypt's agricultural heartland. The city's initial planning involved the famous architect Dinocrates of Rhodes, who designed Alexandria according to Hippodamian principles that emphasized geometric street layouts, designated districts for specific functions, and monumental public buildings that would demonstrate the city's importance as a major Mediterranean commercial and cultural centre. The planned urban area covered approximately 15 square kilometres, with broad avenues intersecting at right angles to create regular city blocks, while the central district housed royal palaces, administrative buildings, and religious structures that combined Greek architectural elements with Egyptian decorative traditions. Alexandria's harbour facilities represented engineering achievements that exceeded contemporary standards throughout the Mediterranean world, featuring artificial breakwaters that created protected anchorages capable of accommodating the largest merchant vessels, while lighthouse installations provided navigation assistance for ships approaching the Egyptian coast. The famous Pharos Lighthouse, though completed during the early Ptolemaic period, was planned during Alexander's initial city foundation and would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world through its innovative design and monumental scale that demonstrated Alexandria's importance as a major commercial hub connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Alexander's journey to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis represented the most significant religious and political event of his brief Egyptian sojourn, as the dangerous desert expedition demonstrated his commitment to Egyptian religious traditions, while the oracle's pronouncements provided divine confirmation of his pharaonic authority. The journey required careful logistical preparation and expert guides familiar with desert navigation, as the route covered over 300 kilometers through harsh terrain, where inadequate water supplies or navigation errors could prove fatal for entire expeditions. The oracle consultation at Siwa involved secret ceremonies conducted according to ancient Egyptian religious protocols that emphasized the pharaoh's direct communication with Amun-Ra, the supreme deity whose cult center at the oasis had maintained its religious significance throughout centuries of foreign occupation and political upheaval. The priest's recognition of Alexander as the legitimate son of Amun provided crucial religious validation for his pharaonic claims while establishing his divine status according to traditional Egyptian concepts that distinguished legitimate rulers from mere military conquerors. Alexander's administrative arrangements for governing Egypt demonstrated sophisticated understanding of local conditions and political requirements, as he appointed both Macedonian and Egyptian officials to key positions while preserving traditional governmental structures that had sustained pharaonic administration throughout previous centuries. The division of authority between military commanders, responsible for garrison forces, and civilian administrators who managed taxation and provincial governance, prevented the concentration of power that might have enabled future rebellions while ensuring effective coordination between different aspects of governmental administration. The appointment of Cleomenes of Naucratis as financial administrator represented a crucial decision that would influence Egyptian economic development throughout the early Hellenistic period, as this Greek merchant possessed detailed knowledge of Egyptian commercial networks and taxation systems, while maintaining connections with Mediterranean trading partners that could facilitate expanded commercial relationships. Cleomenes' policies emphasized the integration of Egyptian agricultural production with Mediterranean market demands, while his administrative reforms standardized taxation procedures and eliminated many of the arbitrary impositions that had characterized Persian rule. Alexander's departure from Egypt in 331 BC to continue his campaigns against Persian forces in Mesopotamia left behind administrative and military arrangements that would provide the foundation for 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The Macedonian garrisons established at Alexandria, Memphis, and other strategic locations maintained sufficient strength to deter internal rebellions, while the governmental structures that Alexander had established provided continuity with traditional Egyptian institutions that legitimized foreign rule in Egyptian eyes. However, the young king's death in Babylon 8 years later would create succession disputes that would fundamentally alter the political landscape throughout his conquered territories. The partition of Alexander's empire among his generals following his death in 323 BC resulted in Ptolemy I Soter's acquisition of Egypt as his personal kingdom, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries while maintaining pharaonic traditions adapted to Hellenistic royal ideology. Ptolemy's position as one of Alexander's most trusted generals provided him with military experience and political connections throughout the Hellenistic world, while his early administrative service in Egypt had given him detailed knowledge of local conditions and governmental requirements that proved crucial for establishing stable rule. Ptolemy's consolidation of power in Egypt involved systematic elimination of potential rivals, while building military and administrative capabilities sufficient to defend Egyptian independence against other successor kingdoms that sought to reunify Alexander's empire under their own authority. The Ptolemaic military system combined traditional Macedonian phalanx formations with Egyptian infantry units, Greek mercenary forces, and allied contingents from throughout the eastern Mediterranean that provided tactical flexibility and numerical strength exceeding that available to most contemporary kingdoms. The establishment of the Ptolemaic capital at Alexandria, rather than traditional Egyptian centres like Memphis or Thebes, reflected the dynasty's commitment to Mediterranean rather than purely Egyptian political orientations, while the city's rapid development into a major commercial and cultural centre demonstrated the economic benefits of Hellenistic rule for Egyptian prosperity. Alexandria's population grew rapidly to exceed 400,000 inhabitants, making it the largest city in the Mediterranean world. The Ptolemaic administrative system represented a sophisticated synthesis of Macedonian royal traditions, Greek governmental concepts, and Egyptian bureaucratic practices that created one of the most efficient administrative structures in the ancient world. The kingdom's division into nomes administered by appointed officials responsible to the royal court maintained traditional Egyptian provincial organisation, while Greek legal concepts and administrative procedures provided standardised governmental methods that eliminated many of the arbitrary practices that had characterised earlier periods of foreign rule. Ptolemaic religious policies demonstrated remarkable sophistication in balancing Greek cultural preferences with Egyptian religious requirements, as the dynasty's rulers adopted full pharaonic titles and participated in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies while maintaining their Greek cultural identity and supporting Greek religious institutions throughout their kingdom. The development of syncretic religious traditions that combined Greek and Egyptian deities created new forms of worship that appealed to both ethnic communities, while the continued operation of traditional Egyptian temples under royal patronage preserved ancient religious practices that legitimized Ptolemaic authority in Egyptian eyes. The construction of the famous library and museum at Alexandria represented the Ptolemaic commitment to Greek intellectual traditions, while their support for Egyptian temple construction and religious festivals demonstrated equal respect for native cultural institutions. The library's collection, which eventually included hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering all branches of ancient knowledge, made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, while providing employment for scholars and scribes from throughout the known world who contributed to advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other fields of learning. Ptolemaic economic policies emphasized the systematic exploitation of Egypt's agricultural productivity, while developing new commercial relationships that integrated Egyptian production with Mediterranean market demands. The kingdom's monopoly system controlled the production and distribution of key commodities including papyrus, linen, and certain luxury goods, while competitive markets operated for agricultural products and manufactured items that generated substantial tax revenues for the royal treasury. These policies created unprecedented prosperity for Egypt, while providing the Ptolemaic court with financial resources that enabled extensive military expenditures and monumental construction projects. The gradual Hellenization of Egyptian urban centres proceeded through voluntary adoption of Greek cultural practices, rather than systematic suppression of native traditions, as Egyptian elites recognized the advantages of Greek education and cultural knowledge for advancement within the Ptolemaic administrative hierarchy. Greek gymnasiums and theatres established in major Egyptian cities provided venues for Greek cultural activities while traditional Egyptian festivals and religious ceremonies continued to operate with royal support and participation. Ptolemaic military organisation incorporated both Greek and Egyptian military traditions, while adapting to the specific strategic requirements of defending Egypt against external threats and maintaining internal stability. The dynasty's naval forces, based primarily at Alexandria, became the dominant Mediterranean fleet during the 3rd century BC, while their land armies combined Macedonian phalanx units with Egyptian infantry, cavalry formations recruited from throughout the kingdom, and war elephants obtained through trading relationships with Indian and African sources. The decline of Ptolemaic power began during the 2nd century BC as internal succession disputes coincided with increasing Roman intervention in eastern Mediterranean affairs, while native Egyptian rebellions challenged royal authority in Upper Egypt. The reigns of Ptolemy IV and his successors witnessed systematic weakening of royal authority as court intrigues eliminated competent administrators, while military resources were diverted to dynastic conflicts rather than external defence or internal development. The native Egyptian rebellions that erupted in Upper Egypt during the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC represented the most serious challenges to Ptolemaic authority since the dynasty's establishment, as Egyptian priests and local leaders exploited royal weakness to establish independent kingdoms centred on traditional religious centres like Thebes and Edfu. These rebellions achieved temporary success in eliminating Ptolemaic administration throughout southern Egypt, while their leaders adopted full pharaonic titles and attempted to restore traditional Egyptian governmental institutions. The suppression of these rebellions required enormous military expenditures that strained Ptolemaic financial resources, while the harsh reprisals that followed eliminated much of the native Egyptian leadership that had provided administrative expertise and cultural continuity throughout the Hellenistic period. The systematic destruction of Egyptian temples and the execution of rebellious priests created lasting resentment among Egyptian populations, while eliminating institutions that had legitimized foreign rule through their incorporation into traditional religious frameworks. Roman intervention in Ptolemaic affairs began during the 2nd century BC as the expanding Roman Republic sought to prevent any single Hellenistic kingdom from achieving dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, while Roman merchants and financiers recognized the enormous economic opportunities available in Egyptian markets. Roman diplomatic support for weak Ptolemaic rulers created dependency relationships that gradually subordinated Egyptian foreign policy to Roman strategic interests, while Roman military intervention in dynastic disputes established precedents for direct Roman involvement in Egyptian internal affairs. The reign of Cleopatra VII, who became pharaoh in 51 BC, represented the final attempt to restore Ptolemaic independence through alliance relationships with powerful Roman leaders who might provide military support against rival Roman factions seeking to establish direct control over Egyptian wealth and strategic positions. Cleopatra's political acumen and cultural sophistication enabled her to maintain Egyptian independence for nearly 2 decades, while her relationships with Julius Caesar and Marcus Antonius provided temporary protection against Roman annexation. Cleopatra's alliance with Julius Caesar involved both personal and political dimensions, as the Roman dictator's military support enabled her to eliminate rival claimants to the Ptolemaic throne, while his protection prevented other Roman leaders from attempting to conquer Egypt during the final phase of the Roman Republic's internal conflicts. The relationship produced a son, Caesarion, whose potential claim to both Egyptian and Roman authority created additional complications in the succession disputes that followed Caesar's assassination in 44 BC. The subsequent alliance between Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius represented a more comprehensive partnership that sought to create an Eastern Mediterranean empire capable of challenging Roman expansion while preserving Hellenistic royal traditions through the establishment of a new dynastic line combining Ptolemaic and Roman authority. Antonius's control over Roman territories in the east provided military resources and strategic positions that strengthened Egyptian defence capabilities, while Cleopatra's wealth and administrative expertise supported Antonius's political ambitions within the broader context of Roman civil warfare. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC marked the decisive confrontation between the combined forces of Antonius and Cleopatra against Octavian's Roman fleet, resulting in a complete defeat that eliminated the last possibility for Egyptian independence while establishing Octavian's dominance throughout the Roman world. The naval engagement involved over 400 warships and demonstrated the tactical superiority of Octavian's forces, while the flight of Antonius and Cleopatra from the battlefield eliminated their credibility as effective military leaders capable of continued resistance to Roman authority. Octavian's invasion of Egypt in 30 BC proceeded without significant resistance, as Antonius's remaining forces either surrendered or fled, while Egyptian populations recognised the futility of opposing the victor of Actium, who now commanded overwhelming military superiority throughout the Mediterranean world. The capture of Alexandria marked the effective end of Ptolemaic rule, while Cleopatra's suicide eliminated the last representative of a dynasty that had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The transformation of Egypt into a Roman province under Augustus represented the final extinction of pharaonic authority that had governed the Nile Valley for over 3 millennia. The new Roman administrative system eliminated traditional Egyptian governmental institutions, while the systematic suppression of native religious practices that had legitimized pharaonic rule throughout Egyptian history marked the definitive end of one of humanity's oldest continuous civilizations. Augustus's administrative arrangements for Roman Egypt emphasized direct imperial control rather than the client-kingdom relationships that Rome had established in other eastern territories, reflecting both Egypt's enormous economic value and the strategic importance of preventing any future challenges to Roman authority in this crucial region. The appointment of Roman prefects rather than native rulers eliminated possibilities for the restoration of independent Egyptian authority, while the systematic Romanization of Egyptian institutions ensured permanent integration into the Roman imperial system. The cultural impact of Roman conquest extended beyond immediate political changes to affect Egyptian religious practices, artistic traditions, and social structures in ways that would permanently alter the character of Egyptian civilization. The suppression of traditional Egyptian temples and the promotion of Roman religious practices eliminated the institutional framework that had preserved pharaonic cultural traditions throughout previous periods of foreign rule, while the systematic destruction of Egyptian historical records and monuments erased much of the documentation that had maintained cultural continuity throughout Egyptian history. The death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BC thus marked not merely the end of Ptolemaic rule, but the final extinction of pharaonic Egypt as an independent political and cultural entity. The Roman province that emerged from Augustus's administrative reorganization bore little resemblance to the kingdom that had dominated the ancient world for millennia, while the systematic elimination of traditional Egyptian institutions ensured that pharaonic civilization would survive only in archaeological remains and fragmentary textual sources that would inspire later generations of scholars and admirers, but could never restore the living culture that had sustained Egyptian greatness throughout the ancient world. The fall of pharaonic Egypt represented one of history's most significant cultural extinctions, as a civilization that had continuously developed for over 3,000 years disappeared permanently under the weight of foreign conquest and cultural suppression. The transformation of Egypt into a Roman province marked the end of the last independent kingdom that maintained direct connections to the ancient world's earliest civilizations, while the systematic destruction of Egyptian cultural institutions eliminated knowledge and traditions that had accumulated over millennia of continuous development.